You arrive at the small side door of the convent chapel of San Marco just as the sky turns from a deep, even grey into a wash of pale gold. The narrow street is still in shadow, and the only sounds are a single distant bell from the monastery tower that rings once and fades, and the soft, throaty coo of pigeons settling on the terracotta roof tiles above. The door is made of old dark wood, studded with iron nails that feel cool and a little rough under your fingers when you push it open. It swings inward without a sound, the hinges well oiled by someone who tends to quiet things, and you step from the cool morning air into an older, stiller coolness inside. The chapel is full of a dim, bluish darkness that seems to hang in the high-vaulted space like a held breath. The air smells in layers. First the mineral dampness of stone that never quite dries, then a faint trace of old incense that has seeped into the plaster over decades, and beneath that the clean, slightly sharp scent of slaked lime from the plasterwork that has become a permanent perfume of the walls. The only light comes from a row of high, narrow windows set deep into the thick masonry, their glass turning the early sky into dusty diamonds of pale lemon, and from 3 small oil lamps that the sacristan has already lit near the altar, their flames steady and small as quiet gold petals. The sacristan himself is a shadow moving away toward the sacristy door, his soft footsteps a series of muted taps on the stone floor, and you do not speak to him because there is nothing that needs saying at this hour. You hang your worn woolen cloak on a wooden peg set into the wall near the entrance, where the plaster is darkened by the touch of many hands over many years. The peg accepts the weight with a tiny creak, and you untie the leather pouch at your belt, setting it on a low stone ledge, its contents giving a faint, dull clink of metal against stone. Inside the pouch are your own small tools, a pointed trowel no longer than your hand, a folding rule made of boxwood, a lump of pumice wrapped in a scrap of linen, and a little bone spatula polished smooth from use. You do not need to look at them to know they are all there. Your fingers know the shape and weight of each thing. You turn toward the day's work area, which is a section of the side wall to the left of the choir, where a large rectangle of rough brown plaster covers the lower half of the wall. This is the artistry, the base layer that was applied yesterday afternoon, and it is still kept from drying too fast by a row of damp linen cloths hanging from a wooden rod. You cross the chapel floor, your soft leather shoes making only a slight brushing sound on the worn limestone, and you lift the edge of one cloth to inspect the plaster. It looks exactly as it should, a dark, chocolatey brown, firm to the touch but still holding a quiet cool moisture, with a texture like fine sandpaper. There are no cracks, no dusty patches, no signs of drying too quickly. You let the cloth fall back into place and feel the subtle weight of the wet linen as it settles. Now you move with the slow automatic rhythm of someone who has done this for many years, your body remembering each step without needing to consult your mind. You walk to the small alcove near the entrance where the water barrel stands, a fat-bellied oak cask with an iron hoop, and you lift the wooden lid to check the water level. The water inside is dark and still, and it smells faintly of the well from which it was drawn, a clean, earthy scent. There is more than enough for the day, and the dipper made of a hollowed gourd floats on the surface, its long handle resting against the rim. You let the lid settle back with a soft, hollow thump. From the storage corner, you bring out 2 wooden buckets, their sides worn smooth from countless trips to the yard, and you set them side by side near the work area. You also fetch the wooden trowel from its hook on the wall, a sturdy thing with a blade of smooth beechwood that has turned a honey color over time, and you place it across the top of one bucket. Beside it, you lay a pig bristle brush, its short stiff hairs a pale cream color, and its handle bound with twine to give a better grip. You arrange these things not in a straight line, but in the natural order in which they will be used. The same arrangement you have made for more mornings than you can easily count. The chapel begins to fill with a different quality of light, as the sun climbs a little higher, and you notice the first true sunbeam of the day sliding slowly across the stone floor. It enters through the highest of the windows and lands at the base of the opposite wall, where an older fresco shows Saint Dominic in a dark blue cloak, his face half turned toward the altar, one hand raised in a gentle gesture that has been fixed in painted plaster for more than 100 years. The sunbeam touches the hem of his robe and makes the blue seem to glow from within. a deep, quiet color that reminds you of the pigment you will grind later. You watch the beam of light without thinking about it, the way it picks out tiny particles of dust that drift and turn in the air like slow-moving stars. The limestone floor beneath your feet has been polished by the daily traffic of monks' sandals over centuries, and in the growing light, you can see the shallow depressions worn into the stone, like the gentle hollows in a woodland path. There is no sound from the piazza yet, no murmur or footfall beyond the thick walls, only the chapel's own peaceful, breathing silence. Somewhere behind the carved wooden choir stalls, you hear a tiny scratch, a mouse perhaps, moving among the old prayer books and dust. And then it stops, and the silence settles in again, even deeper than before. You spend a long moment simply standing still, your hands resting lightly on the edge of the water barrel, your eyes traveling over the walls you know so well. The frescoes that cover the side chapels show scenes you have looked at hundreds of times. St. Peter Martyr with a calm, round face, a golden halo that has faded to a soft ochre, and St. Thomas Aquinas holding a book and a quill, his robes a muted red. There are small cracks in the plaster near the window frames, fine as hairs, and here and there a patch of damp has left a ghostly bloom of pale grey on the stone. A spider has built a web in the corner of the wooden ceiling beam above the altar, and the web catches the light like a tiny irregular silk map of fine threads. None of these things are remarkable, and that is what makes them a comfort. You return your attention to the work area and kneel down beside the damp cloths, lifting them one by one to check the oricio again, even though you checked it only a few minutes earlier. The plaster is cool under your palm, and you press your fingers very gently into the surface to feel its firmness. The slight spring of the lime and sand mixture. It will need a little more water soon, but not yet. You smooth the cloths back into place and listen to the wet fabric make a small peeling sound as it detaches from the wall. Then a soft pat as it resettles. A pigeon coos again, closer now, perhaps just on the roof ledge above the door, and its call is a low, throaty repetition that rises and falls like a tiny wave of sound. The distant bell from the monastery tower gives two deep, unhurried notes marking the passing of half an hour, and the notes hang in the air for a few seconds before they are absorbed by the heavy walls. You stand up slowly, feeling the slight ache in your knees from the hard floor, and you walk to the small window near the side door to look out at the cloister yard. It is still in shadow, the grass wet with dew, and a single blackbird hops across the path with a quick bobbing motion before disappearing under a rosemary bush. The sky above the cloister is a pale, washed blue now, and you can see one small cloud moving very slowly from east to west, its edges soft as brushed wool. You turn back into the chapel and notice that the oil in the lamps is burning low, the flames beginning to flicker with a little more yellow, so you take the small copper oil jug that sits on a shelf beneath the altar and carefully refill each of the 3 lamps. The oil is thick and golden, and it pours in a slow, steady thread, lugging softly from the narrow spout. The wicks drink it up, and the flames rise again, steady and silent. The scent of the oil, a faint sweetness like crushed seeds, joins the other smells in the air. Now you stand near the altar for a moment, looking up at the high wooden crucifix that hangs above it, a simple shape of dark wood without gold or jewels. The figure carved with a quiet dignity. You are not praying, at least not with words. You are simply being still, the way a room is still when no one is in it. The mouse scratches again behind the choir stalls, a tiny persistent sound that belongs to the chapel as much as the stones themselves, and you find it more soothing than silence would be. You walk back to the work area and untie the leather pouch again, this time removing the small trowel and laying it beside the wooden one, though you will not need it for hours yet. You also take out the pumice lump, which you use to smooth the plaster edges, and you set it on a clean rag where it will not pick up grit. The bone spatula you place next to it, its creamy surface glowing faintly in the dim light, and you run your thumb along its edge without thinking, a small habit of reassurance. The sun has moved enough now that the beam on the floor has shifted, leaving St. Dominic's robe in shadow again, and illuminating a plain section of wall where there are no frescoes, only the subtle texture of countless trowel strokes left by a plasterer long before you were born. You can see the faint arcs and walls in the plaster, the signature of a hand that moved with rhythm and care, and you feel a quiet kinship with that unknown worker, a connection made of lime and sand and water. You pick up the wooden trowel and feel its balance, the way the handle fits into your palm, warm perfectly to your grip after years of use. You set it down again and pick up the pig bristle brush, testing the stiffness of the bristles against the back of your hand, a prickly tickling sensation that makes you blink slowly. Everything is ready. The buckets are in place. The water barrel is full. The arricchio is moist. The tools are laid out. The lamps are burning. The chapel is quiet. And the day ahead is as predictable as the slow arc of the sun across the high windows. You lean your shoulder against the cool stone of the wall and let your eyes rest on the section of blank plaster that will soon receive the first brushstrokes of the intonaco layer. The air is so still that you can hear the tiny crisp sound of the wicks burning in the oil lamps, a faint hiss and pop that is almost below the edge of hearing. The pigeons on the roof have gone silent, perhaps having flown away to the piazza in search of crumbs, and the blackbird in the cloister has finished its song. The world outside the chapel door seems far away, as though it existed in a different morning altogether. Time passes in the way it does when there is nothing to mark it, a smooth, slow current that carries you without effort from one small task to another. You walk again to the water barrel and dip the gourd dipper into the dark, cool water, raising it to your lips and drinking a few sips. The water tastes of stone and earth, and it is so cold it makes your teeth ache faintly for a second. Then the feeling passes. You pour the last drops back into the barrel, watching the tiny ripples spread and vanish, and then you replace the lid. A new sound reaches you, so distant and faint that at first you think it might be the wind in the cloister cypress trees. It is the voice of a single bell, not the monastery bell, but some other church in the city, ringing the call to morning mass. Its tone is higher and thinner, a silvery thread of sound that unravels slowly across the rooftops. You listen to it as you might listen to rain on a window, without needing to attend to it, letting it become part of the quiet background of the chapel. You turn one more slow circle, your eyes passing over the wooden pews with their straight, unyielding backs, the worn red cushion at the prioress's stall, the brass candlestick on the altar that has tarnished to a soft brown, the small painted panel of the Annunciation in the side chapel, where the blue of the Virgin's mantle is the same shade you hope to achieve in the new fresco. Everything is in order. Everything is calm. The arricchio plaster waits under its damp cloths like a secret kept safe through the night, and the day's first true task of mixing the fresh intonaco layer is still a comfortable distance ahead. You fold your arms across your chest and lean more fully against the wall, feeling the chill of the stone seep slowly through the fabric of your tunic. The scratch of the mouse behind the choir stalls has stopped now, and the silence is complete, except for the gentle, rhythmic sound of your own breathing. You close your eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to rest them. And behind your eyelids the darkness is a warm, reddish-brown, the color of the arricchio plaster. You can feel the slow pulse of your heartbeat in your temples, a soft, steady clock that measures nothing at all. When you open your eyes again, the light has changed by another small degree. The sunbeam now a short golden rectangle on the floor near the entrance door, and you notice that a small dry leaf has blown in from the cloister and lies curled on the stones like a tiny brown hand. You bend and pick it up, and its texture is crisp and weightless, and you carry it to the door and set it outside on the step where the breeze will take it away later. The cool morning air touches your face, and you can smell the city waking somewhere beyond the convent walls. A faint drift of wood smoke and fresh bread that is as yet barely a suggestion. You step back inside and close the door with the same silent, oiled swing. The chapel receives you again with its dim, comforting stillness, and you walk once more to the work area, this time lifting the corner of a damp cloth and pressing your palm flat against the arricchio surface. It is still perfectly moist, cool as a river stone, and it yields the tiniest bit under your hand, like firm dough before it is baked. You pat it very gently, a small, reassuring tap, and then you let the cloth fall back. Now you sit down on the low wooden bench that stands against the wall, the one the monks use when they put on their sandals, and you let your hands rest loosely on your knees. The bench is polished smooth from the habit of many years, and it feels almost warm, as though it has absorbed the body heat of 100 silent figures. You look at the high window where the sky is now a clean, bright blue, and you watch the small cloud that you noticed earlier drift slowly out of sight beyond the frame. its edges dissolving little by little into the immensity of the morning. The monastery bell gives 3 deep notes, half an hour again, and the sound rolls through the stone walls like a slow wave washing up on a shore. You feel ready, not with any excitement, but with the quiet, settled readiness of a tool waiting in its proper place. The day ahead holds nothing unexpected, mixing lime paste, sifting sand, combining them into the smooth white intonaco that will become the day's giornata, and then the grinding of the blue stone that costs more than a month's wages. But all that is still to come, still resting in the future like a book waiting to be opened. For now, you simply sit on the bench, breathing the chapel's layered air, and listen to the silence that is not a silence at all, but a tapestry of tiny, gentle sounds. The oil lamps hissing, the distant silver bell, and the soft, steady, unfaltering beat of your own heart. The wooden bench creaks softly as you rise, a small sound that vanishes instantly into the thick chapel air. Your knees feel the familiar, slight stiffness from sitting still on the cool stone, but it passes after the first few steps toward the side door. You pause at the water barrel to dip your fingers into the cool, dark water and touch them to your forehead. A brief refreshment that leaves a cooling trail on your skin. Then you lift the iron latch of the side door and step out into the cloister walk. The transition from chapel to cloister is a gentle shock of light and air. The covered walkway runs around a square garden where the grass is still wet with a silver-grey dew, and the cypress trees at the corners stand straight and dark like sentinels who have not moved for centuries. The sky above the open square is now a clean, washed blue, and the sunlight falls on the eastern arcade in long, honey-colored rectangles that warm the stone flags underfoot. You walk through alternating bands of cool shadow and mild warmth, your soft shoes making a faint, regular brushing sound that echoes quietly along the empty arcade. At the far end of the cloister, beyond the well with its wrought iron cover and the small stone bench where the oldest monk sometimes sits to read in the afternoon, there is a low opening that leads into the workyard. This yard is not large, just a rectangle of packed earth between the chapel wall and the convent kitchen. But it has served as the plaster maker's corner for so long that the ground itself is dusted with a fine white powder that puffs up in tiny clouds around your feet. The smell here is different from the chapel, sharper, cleaner, a scent of stone and water, and the particular cool, almost soapy smell of aged lime. In one corner of the yard, shaded by a slanting roof of terracotta tiles supported by 2 wooden posts, sits the lime pit. It is a square hole dug into the earth and lined with old bricks, covered by a heavy wooden lid with iron rings. You kneel beside it, feeling the damp earth soak a little chill through the fabric at your knees, and you grit the iron rings with both hands. The lid lifts with a low grinding scrape, and the smell that rises from the pit is rich and mineral, like the inside of a seashell or the dust after a summer rain on limestone hills. You set the lid aside against the brick lining and look down into the darkness of the pit. The slaked lime has been maturing here for many months, ever since the master ordered this batch to be prepared for the new fresco cycle. It rests in a thick, creamy layer, pale as milk, that has been poured into a grey stone bowl. The surface is perfectly smooth and covered with a thin film of water that catches the light like a mirror of dull silver. You reach down with the flat wooden paddle that hangs on a hook beside the pit and press it gently into the lime. The consistency is perfect, dense and buttery with no lumps, no graininess, no skin of dried crust. The paddle sinks in slowly and comes out coated with a thick white layer that clings to the wood like soft cheese. You tap the paddle against the edge of the pit and watch the lime slide back down with a slow, reluctant plop. You take the smaller of your 2 buckets, the one with the smooth beechwood handle worn dark from many trips across this yard, and you lower it carefully into the pit. The lime is so thick that you have to work the bucket gently from side to side, letting it fill little by little with the heavy white paste. When you lift it out, the weight pulls at your arm and shoulder with a familiar, steady ache. The lime in the bucket looks like something between cream and soft clay, and its surface holds the shape of the bucket's rim for a moment before settling flat. You carry the bucket back across the yard, walking slowly so the thick lime does not slosh over the rim. The morning sun has crept a little further across the cloister, and a single bee drones past your head, its body a small, dark, furry blur against the pale arcade wall, heading toward the rosemary bush near the novice's cells. You pause for a moment to watch it disappear into the blue-grey needles, and then you continue on into the chapel through the side door, the bucket bumping gently against your leg. Inside, the chapel air feels cooler and more still than the yard, and it takes your eyes a moment to adjust from the bright sun to the dim, lamp-lit interior. You set the bucket of lime on the stone floor near your work area, and the dull thump of its base on the flag sends a tiny echo skittering up into the vaulted ceiling. Then you go back to the yard, this time carrying the larger bucket and a small wooden shovel that leans against the chapel wall. The river sand is stored in a heavy hemp sack in the corner of the yard, protected from rain by the same slanted roof that shades the lime pit. You untie the rough cord that closes the sack and fold back its mouth, revealing the sand inside. It is a good, clean river sand from the Arno, brought up by mule cart in large baskets and stored here in the shade. You scoop the shovel into the sand, and the sound is a crisp, granular scrape like a boot on dry gravel. The sand grains are sharp and angular, not rounded smooth like sea sand, which means they will bind well with the lime and create a strong plaster. You tilt the shovel over the large bucket, and the sand pours in with a soft, rushing hiss, each grain catching the light as it falls. You fill the bucket to just below the rim, not too full, so that you can still carry it without spilling, and then you tie the sack closed again and return to the chapel. Now the two buckets sit side by side near the work area, one full of dense white lime paste, the other full of sharp grey sand. On the floor between them, you lay a wide wooden board, the mortar board, its surface worn smooth and slightly hollowed in the center from years of mixing. You also bring over a small bucket of clean water from the barrel, and you set it within easy reach. The morning has grown a little warmer, not hot, but comfortable, and the light from the high windows is stronger now, falling in long, slanting rectangles across the nave. You kneel on a folded sack beside the mortarboard, feeling the rough fabric cushion your knees against the hard stone. Using the wooden trowel, you scoop out a portion of the lime paste and spread it onto the board in a thick, smooth mound. The lime holds its shape, white and glistening, and it gives off that clean mineral scent that has come to mean work and quiet and the beginning of things. You take up a small wooden scoop and dip it into the sand, and you begin to sift the sand over the lime in a steady, even layer. The sand grains fall in a thin, rattling curtain, bouncing slightly as they land on the soft white paste. You do this slowly, watching the proportions without needing to measure, the knowledge living in your hands and not in your head. When you have added the right amount of sand, you take the hoe-like tool with its curved iron blade and its long wooden handle polished to a dark shine, and you begin to fold the mixture together. The motion is a steady rhythm. Lift the iron blade, push it forward into the mound, fold the lime over the sand, draw the blade back, and repeat. The mixture begins to combine slowly, the white lime swallowing the grey sand, and the color changes from stark white to a soft, even grey, the color of a winter sky at dusk. You work the hoe with a patient, circular motion, moving around the board so that every part of the mixture gets turned and blended. The sound is a low, wet, scraping noise, punctuated by the occasional click of the iron blade against the wood. You pause after a while to add a little water from the bucket, pouring it from a small dipper in a thin, controlled stream. The water sinks into the mixture and darkens it for a moment before you fold it in with the hoe. The plaster becomes smoother now, the grit of the sand softening into the body of the lime, and the consistency changes to something like a very thick porridge or a soft dough. You test it with a trowel, lifting a small amount and tilting the blade. The plaster holds its shape, not slumping, not crumbling, just clinging to the wood with a perfect creamy adherence. It is exactly as the master taught you, smooth enough to spread, firm enough to stay where it is placed. The mixing continues for some time, a slow rhythm of folding and turning and adding tiny amounts of water, checking the consistency against the memory stored in your fingers. Outside the chapel, the city is waking fully now. Through the high windows you can hear a vendor shouting faintly about fresh bread, the words indecipherable, but the tone unmistakable. A long rising and falling call that sounds like a song. A mule brays from somewhere near the old market. A harsh honking sound that echoes off the stone facades of the buildings and fades into a series of snorts. A flock of sparrows rises from the piazza with a sudden burst of wing beats. A a sound like a handful of small pebbles thrown into the air and then settles again. All these sounds come to you softened and distant, made gentle by the thickness of the chapel walls, as though they belong to a world that exists only in memory. You sit back on your heels for a moment and wipe your forehead with the back of your hand. The plaster on the board is ready, a smooth mound of pale grey that glistens faintly in the lamplight. You take the pig bristle brush and dip it very lightly in water, then run it around the edge of the board to gather up any stray bits of plaster that have crept to the sides. These you fold back into the main mound with the tip of the trowel, wasting nothing. Then you take one of the damp clods from the Aricio wall and wring it out over the water bucket, and you drape it carefully over the fresh plaster, tucking the edges around the mound so that the air cannot dry it out. The wet cloth makes a soft, settling sound as it conforms to the shape beneath. You stand up slowly, feeling the faint ache in your lower back from kneeling, and you stretch your arms upward, not in a rush, but with the slow, deliberate satisfaction of a task done well. The monastery bell rings again, 4 deep notes that roll through the air and blend with the distant sounds of the waking city. You walk to the water barrel and pour a dipper of water over your hands, rubbing them together to wash away the sticky traces of lime. The water turns milky for a moment and then runs clear down the small stone drain set into the floor. You dry your hands in the rag tucked into your belt and look at the covered mound of plaster. It will rest now, the intonaco waiting under its damp cover, until the master arrives and decides the exact moment to apply it to the wall. The timing is important. Too early and the plaster will be too wet. Too late and it will begin to set and lose its receptiveness to the paint. But there is no hurry. The morning has been spent in slow, careful preparation, and the plaster is exactly as it should be, a patient material that asks for nothing but the right amount of water and the right amount of time. You pick up the wooden trowel and the hoe and carry them back to the water barrel, where you rinse each one carefully. The iron blade of the hoe needs a little extra attention, a gentle scrape with a scrap of linen to remove the last traces of lime before they can harden and rust the metal. You dry the tools with a clean rag and hang them back on their hooks, the trowel on the wall near the work area and the hoe on a larger peg beside the door. Then you sweep around the work area with a small hand broom of dried twigs, gathering the few grains of spilled sand and the tiny splatters of lime into a neat pile, which you scoop onto a piece of old leather and carry to the yard to scatter on the earth. Back in the chapel, you stand for a moment looking at the covered plaster and the moist Aricio wall beneath its row of hanging cloths. Everything is quiet and in order. The master has not yet arrived, which is not unusual. He often spends the early morning in his own quarters, sketching or mixing the egg tempera that he will use later. You have learned not to watch the door or listen for his step, but simply to be ready when he comes. You walk to the small alcove where the pigment stores are kept. A locked wooden chest placed in the driest and darkest corner of the chapel. The chest has an iron lock, but you do not have the key. The master carries it himself because the pigments inside are worth more than a year of your wages. Still, you touch the smooth lid of the chest as you pass, feeling the cool wood under your fingers, knowing that inside rests the lump of lapis lazuli that you will grind later in the day. The thought of the blue stone, its deep celestial color, its flecks of fool's gold and its weight in your palm, is a quiet anticipation that sits in the back of your mind like a small, pleasant secret. You return to the wooden bench and sit down, your hands resting on your knees, your breathing slow and even. The chapel has grown a little warmer now, the stone wall slowly absorbing the heat of the day. The spider near the altar has come out to the center of its web and sits motionless, its 8 tiny legs like fine hairs against the light. The oil lamps burn on, their flame steady in gold, and the sound of the city outside is a distant woven murmur that rises and falls without any pattern you need to follow. You close your eyes and let your thoughts drift, not toward anything in particular, just the slow, calm current of a mind at rest, waiting for the next small movement of the day. The covered mound of fresh plaster rests under its damp cloth, patient and still, and you turn away from it knowing it will be ready when the master calls for it. Now your attention moves to the other task that has been waiting at the back of your mind all morning, the task that carries its own quiet weight and its own particular rhythm. You walk across the chapel floor toward the small alcove where the locked wooden chest sits in its pool of shadow, and as you go, you pick up the low wooden stool that stands near the choir stalls, carrying it easily under one arm. The stool's legs have been worn slightly uneven over the years, so it rocks a little when you set it down, but you know exactly how to angle it so that it sits firm and still on the limestone flags. You position the stool near the window where the light falls in a clean, pale rectangle, the best spot for work that requires a steady eye. Then you go to the water barrel and fill a small clay bowl with clean water, and you set it on the floor beside the stool, along with a folded rag. From the storage alcove you fetch the bronze mortar, a heavy bowl with a wide base and slightly flared sides, its surface a dark, dull gold that has been burnished to a soft shine on the inside by years of grinding. It takes both hands to carry it, and the weight is satisfying, cold and solid against your palms. You set it on the stool, and it makes a low, resonant sound, like a muted bell, as the bronze touches the wood. Next you bring the pestle, a heavy cylinder of the same dark bronze with a rounded end and a slightly wider top that fits comfortably into the curve of your hand. It is smooth from countless hours of use, and its surface is marked with very fine scratches that run in long, even arcs. You place the pestle inside the mortar and then stand for a moment, making sure everything is arranged exactly as you need it. The light from the window falls at just the right angle, catching the rim of the mortar and turning it into a thin line of gold. Now you go to the locked chest. The master arrived a short while ago, entering the chapel through the side door with a nod and a quiet word about the plaster's readiness. He left the key with you for the specific purpose of retrieving the lapis lazuli, a gesture of trust that is as old as your apprenticeship. The key sits on a leather cord, hanging from a peg beside the chest, a small iron thing with a simple loop and the single tooth, and you take it down carefully, threading the cord over your wrist so it cannot be dropped. The lock opens with a small, precise click, the sound swallowed immediately by the thick chapel air, and you lift the heavy wooden lid. Inside the chest, wrapped in a piece of soft, undyed linen, lies the blue stone. You lift the bundle with both hands, carrying it as you would carry a sleeping bird, and you set it on the floor beside the mortar before closing and locking the chest again. The key goes back on its peg, and you return your full attention to the wrapped bundle. You kneel on the folded sack that you have placed beside the stool, settling your weight slowly until you are comfortable, and you unfold the linen with the same care you would use to open the pages of an old book. The stone lies revealed in the pale window light, and for a long moment you simply look at it. The lapis lazuli is the size of a child's fist, but it is not round. It is an irregular shape with flat planes and sharp edges and one broad, slightly concave surface that catches the light like dark water under a storm sky. Its color is not a simple blue, but a deep, complex indigo that seems to shift as you turn your head, sometimes darker, sometimes lighter, with veins of white calcite running through it like frozen threads of frost. Here and there, tiny flecks of pyrite sparkle with a dull golden glint, the fool's gold that the old manuscripts call the stars in the stone. The surface is slightly rough, with a fine dusty bloom that rubs off on your fingertips when you touch it, leaving a pale blue smear on your skin. You lift the stone very gently, feeling its weight and its coolness, and you set it down on the folded rag that you have spread beside the mortar. Then you pick up a small iron hammer, its head no bigger than a walnut, and a short, thick iron chisel. These are the tools for the first rough breaking, the reduction of the whole stone into smaller fragments that can be ground. You do not rush into this work. You sit for a moment, breathing the chapel's quiet air, listening to the distant sounds that seep through the high windows. Outside, the city has been stirring all morning, and now a new sound is beginning to take shape in the piazza beyond the convent walls. It is not a loud sound, not yet, but a low, steady murmur that rises and falls like the breathing of a large, patient animal. It is the sound of a crowd gathering, people moving toward the square where the preacher will speak. Their footsteps a continuous soft shuffling, and their voices a blended hum that has no distinct words. The sound drifts through the high windows as a muted background, no more intrusive than the cooing of the pigeons or the rustle of the cypress trees in the cloister. You do not consciously listen to it, but it is there, a distant texture woven into the morning. You pick up the hammer and the chisel. The first task is to break the stone into pieces small enough to fit into the mortar, and this must be done with care so that no precious fragments are lost. You wrap the stone loosely in a piece of heavy leather, leaving one small section exposed, and you hold it steady on the stone floor with your left hand. The chisel is placed against the chosen breaking point, and you tap it very gently with the hammer. The sound is a sharp metallic click that echoes off the vaulted ceiling, and a tiny flake of blue skitters away across the floor. You retrieve it at once, pressing it into the palm of your hand with a fingertip and dropping it into the bronze mortar. Then you tap again. The work continues in this way, a slow, patient series of small taps and adjustments. You turn the stone, find a new angle, place the chisel, tap, and listen to the crisp sound that rings out in the quiet air. Slowly, the large stone yields to many small blows, and pieces begin to separate along its natural cracks and veins. The fragments vary in size. Some are as large as a thumbnail, others no bigger than a peppercorn. Each piece still carries the deep blue color of the whole, but now you can see the internal structure more clearly, the way the blue runs in streaks and swirls, the way the pyrite flecks are scattered like random thoughts. You gather all the fragments into a neat pile on the rag, and you inspect them carefully, picking out any pieces that show too much white calcite or too many pyrite inclusions. These you set aside in a small clay pot, not as waste, but as material that can be used for lesser purposes: a scumble over dried plaster, a tint for the underdrawing, a wash for the borders. The best fragments, those with the purest and deepest blue, you separate into a little heap on the cleanest part of the rag. These are the ones that will become the azurite pigment for the Virgin's mantle, a blue so costly that it is worth more than gold. The distant murmur in the piazza has grown a little louder while you worked, and now you can distinguish a single voice rising above the crowd noise. The voice is thin at this distance, attenuated by the stone walls and the open space of the square, but it carries a rhythmic cadence that marks it unmistakably as a preacher's speech. The words are too far away to be understood. They are only patterns of sound, rising and falling, pausing and resuming, like waves breaking on a distant shore. The voice has a quality that holds attention even when the meaning is lost, a conviction that travels through the air as pure tone. But you do not stop your work to listen more closely. Your attention remains on the small heap of blue fragments, on the bronze mortar, on the pestle that waits in your hand. You reach down and pick up a single fragment, the largest of the pure pieces, and you drop it into the bronze mortar. It lands with a small, hard clink against the metal, a sound that seems to hang in the air for a fraction of a second longer than it should. You add a second fragment, then a third, but not too many at once. The grinding must proceed in small batches so that each piece is reduced evenly and no coarse grains remain. You pick up the pestle with your right hand, kerning your fingers around its smooth, cool weight, and you lower the rounded end into the mortar. The first motion is a gentle downward press, not a strike, but a steady crushing. The fragments resist for a moment, then give way with a series of faint, gritty crunches that travel up through the pestle and into the bones of your hand. You lift the pestle, turn it slightly, and press down again. This is the beginning of the true grinding, a rhythm that will occupy you for a long while, and you settle into it as naturally as you settled into the mixing of the plaster. The pestle rises and falls in a slow, unhurried cycle. You move it in small circles around the inside of the mortar, grinding the fragments against the curved bronze walls. The sound is a low, grinding, slightly musical noise, a shush and a crunch combined, with occasional sharper clicks when a particularly hard piece of pyrite is caught under the pestle. The bluestone begins to break down into smaller and smaller grains, and a fine dust rises from the mortar, a pale blue haze that catches the window light and hangs in the air for a moment before settling onto the rim of the mortar and onto the back of your hand. You pause and peer into the mortar. The fragments are now a coarse, granular powder, deep blue mixed with paler specks, and you can see that some pieces are still too large. You pick out these larger bits with your fingers, dropping them back into the center of the mortar for more grinding, and you continue the circling motion with the pestle. The rhythm is hypnotic, a slow, steady rotation that requires just enough attention to keep the pestle moving evenly, but not so much that your mind cannot drift away into a peaceful, wordless state. The ache in your shoulder begins as a faint awareness of effort, but it is not unpleasant. It is the familiar companion of all manual work, a dull, warm sensation that spreads slowly down your arm. Outside, the preacher's voice continues its distant rise and fall. A new layer of crowd noise has joined it now, a responsive murmur that swells and recedes in the gaps between the preacher's phrases. Sometimes the voice grows louder, as if the speaker has turned toward the convent walls, and then it drops away again, as if he has turned back to the main body of the crowd. The pigeons on the roof take flight with a sudden clatter of wings, circle once over the piazza, and then return to their perches. The city continues its morning rhythm, cartwheels on cobblestones somewhere far away, the faint bark of a dog, the distant call of a mother to a child. You empty the first small batch of crushed stone into a shallow ceramic dish, and you begin a second batch with more of the clean fragments from the rag. The process repeats exactly. Drop the stones into the mortar, settle the pestle, press and grind in slow circles. The sound is the same, the movement is the same, the faint blue dust floats up in the same pale haze. The repetition is not tedious, it is calming, a steady rhythm that occupies your body while your thoughts float in a calm, quiet space. You can feel the temperature of the bronze mortar slowly warming under your hand, the metal absorbing the heat of your palm and the friction of the grinding. After the second batch, you set down the pestle and rest your hands on your knees. You look at the ceramic dish, which now holds a small mound of crushed lapis lazuli, a granular powder that ranges in color from the deepest indigo to a pale, dusty blue. The pyrite flecks glitter among the grains, like tiny stars scattered in a twilight sky. You know that this is not the final stage. The powder is still too coarse, and further grinding with the glass muller on the porphyry slab will be needed to reduce it to the finest pigment. But that will come later, after the washing and the sorting that refine the color still further. For now, the rough grinding is a good beginning, a necessary first step that transforms the raw stone into something that can be worked and shaped. You pour the contents of the ceramic dish carefully onto a sheet of clean paper, spreading the coarse powder into a thin, even layer. Then you pick up the small iron knife with its narrow blade, and you begin the slow, meticulous work of sorting. The knife tip moves across the paper, nudging aside any grains that are too pale, any specks of pure white calcite that have survived the grinding, any larger chunks that need to be returned to the mortar. The sorted pile of good blue powder grows slowly on one side of the paper, while the rejected bits are swept into the clay pot with the others. This work requires no strength, only patience and a steady hand, and you lean close over the paper, your face bathed in the soft blue-grey light that reflects up from the powder. The preacher's voice swells again, a long, sustained phrase that carries through the high windows with an almost musical quality. A word separates itself from the flow of sound, a single syllable that might be pace or papum, but it is gone before you can be sure, dissolved back into the general murmur. A flag flaps somewhere in the piazza, a sound like a heavy sheet shaken out flat, and then it is still. The convent itself remains utterly quiet around you, the chapel a shelter of thick stone that dampens and softens everything from outside. You are aware of the voice in the same way you are aware of the sunbeam moving slowly across the floor, a distant, gentle presence that asks for nothing. You complete the sorting and fold the paper carefully around the good blue powder, tucking the edges to make a secure little packet. This you place in a clean wooden box that sits on the shelf in the alcove, a box with a sliding lid that keeps out dust and light. The rejected bits in the clay pot you cover with a small piece of tile, and the remaining fragments of raw stone that are still too large for grinding you wrap once more in the linen cloth and return to the locked chest for safekeeping. The mortar and pestle need to be cleaned now, and you carry them out to the yard where the light is bright and the air is fresh. You pour a little water from the yard bucket into the mortar and swirl it around, watching the rinse water turn a pale, milky blue, the color of a thin winter sky. This rinse water is not thrown away. You pour it into a settling jar that stands in the corner, a tall clay vessel where the fine particles of blue will slowly sink to the bottom and form a sediment that can be collected later. Not a grain of the precious pigment is wasted. You wipe the mortar dry with a clean rag, polish the inside until it gleams, and do the same for the pestle, rubbing the smooth bronze until it is free of any blue residue. Back in the chapel, you return the mortar and pestle to their shelf in the alcove, and you wash your hands in the water barrel, watching the pale blue stain disappear into the drain. Your hands smell faintly of metal and stone, that particular scent of bronze and crushed rock that lingers even after washing. You dry them on your rag and look around the chapel. The master is still not present. He must be in the sacristy or the cloister library consulting the drawings or mixing other colors. The damp cloths on the plaster mound and on the erixio wall are still moist. The work area is tidy. The morning has passed in a slow, steady progression of small tasks. You sit down on the bench and listen. The crowd murmur outside has not lessened, and the preacher's voice rises and falls with the same distant rhythmic cadence. It has become a part of the morning now, as constant and unobtrusive as the flow of water through the underground channels or the slow creaking of the cypress trees in the wind. You close your eyes and let the sounds wash over you, not trying to separate them, not trying to understand them. The blue dust still clings faintly to the creases in your palms, a ghost of the stone's color that will fade with the next washing. The bronze mortar sits on its shelf, clean and waiting, and the little packet of ground powder rests in its wooden box, a seed of color that will bloom into the deepest blue on the chapel wall when the time comes for painting. The wooden box with its folded paper packet of crushed blue stone sits on the alcove shelf, and you let it rest there for a while as you attend to the small, steady rituals that keep the chapel in order. You walk to the water barrel and check the level again, finding it still more than half full, the dark surface undisturbed except for the faint tremor caused by your footsteps on the stone flags. You take the dipper and pour a small amount of water into the clay bowl you had set aside earlier. Then you carry the bowl to the work area and place it on the wide stone ledge that runs along the base of the wall. The ledge is cool and smooth, and the bowl settles onto it with a tiny wet click. Now you retrieve the wooden box from the alcove, sliding the lid open with a soft rasp of wood against wood. Inside, the paper packet sits exactly as you left it, its edges still crisply folded. You lift it out and carry it to the ledge, then unfold the paper slowly, revealing the small heap of crushed lapis lazuli. The coarse powder looks darker now, in the dimmer light of this corner, more indigo than blue, with the pyrite flecks catching the lamp glow and winking like tiny earthbound stars. You take a moment to appreciate the color before you begin the next stage of its transformation. The process you're about to undertake is the washing, the levigation that will separate the finest pigment grains from the coarser material and remove the last impurities that even careful sorting cannot catch. It is a task that requires patience and a gentle hand, for the blue particles are heavy and sink quickly in water, while the lighter impurities float and can be poured away. You have done this many times before, with earth pigments and ground minerals, but the lapis requires a particular care because of its value and because the difference between a cloudy grayish blue and a pure luminous ultramarine lies precisely in this patient washing. You fetch a wide, shallow ceramic bowl from the alcove, its inner surface glazed a soft cream color that will make it easy to see the blue sediment against the bottom. You also bring a larger basin, a deep earthenware vessel that you place on the floor beside the ledge, and a small pitcher of clean water from the barrel. The arrangement of these vessels around you creates a small, ordered workspace. Everything within easy reach, the powder on its paper, the shallow bowl on the ledge, the basin on the floor, the pitcher at your right hand. You pour clean water into the shallow bowl until it is a little more than half full, and you watch the surface settle into a flat, still disc that reflects the high window as a pale grey rectangle. Then you pick up the paper with its mound of blue powder, and you tilt it very carefully over the bowl. The powder slides down the crease in the paper in a thin, granular stream and enters the water with a soft, pattering sound, like fine sand falling on a drumhead. The blue grains sink at once, spreading out as they fall and creating small swirling clouds of color that bloom and fade in the clear water. The pyrite flecks, heavier still, drop straight down with tiny, bright flashes, while the lighter calcite particles and the finest blue dust hang suspended, turning the water a milky, pale turquoise. You set the empty paper aside, and you dip your fingers into the bowl. The water is cool and silky, and you begin to swirl it very gently, moving your hand in a slow circular motion just beneath the surface. The blue sediment on the bottom stirs and rises in lazy, drifting spirals, and the lighter impurities lift into the water column and begin to float. You continue the gentle swirling, watching the color separate into layers, the heavy blue grains settling back quickly to the bottom, the pale, cloudy material staying suspended longer, and a very fine, almost invisible film of impurities rising to the surface. The motion of your hand is slow and rhythmic, a quiet, liquid dance that requires no force, only a steady, patient circular movement. After a time, you stop swirling and withdraw your hand, letting the water become still again. The heavy blue sinks at once, forming a dark, granular layer on the bottom of the bowl. Above it, the water is cloudy with suspended particles, a soft, milky blue-white that looks like the sky on a hazy winter morning. You wait, counting your own slow breaths until the water has settled as much as it will, and then you lift the bowl carefully with both hands. The next step is the first pouring off, the decanting that removes the floating impurities and the lightest, chalkiest particles. You tilt the bowl very slightly over the large earthenware basin on the floor, and the cloudy water begins to flow out in a thin, controlled stream over the glazed rim. You pour slowly, watching the stream with close attention, stopping the moment you see the darker blue sediment begin to slide toward the rim. The cloudy water falls into the basin with a soft, splashing sound that echoes faintly in the quiet chapel, and when you set the bowl down again, the blue sediment remains behind, a little cleaner than before. This water you have poured off is not waste. It carries in its cloudiness the very finest particles of blue, particles so small that they remain suspended for a long time before settling. The earthenware basin on the floor is the settling vessel, and you will leave it undisturbed for hours, so that the fine blue gradually sinks to the bottom and forms a soft, pale sediment that can be collected and used for washes and glazes. The master has taught you that every part of the precious stone has its use, and nothing is discarded. You pour fresh water into the shallow bowl, covering the blue sediment again, and you begin the swirling once more. Your fingers move in the same slow circles, the blue rises and falls in the same lazy spirals, the cloudiness blooms again in the water. The repetition is deeply calming, a watery rhythm that seems to slow your thoughts and merge them with the gentle motion of your hand. Outside, the preacher's voice continues its distant rise and fall, now stronger, now fainter, a continuous sound that has been present for so long that it has become part of the chapel's atmosphere, like the scent of lime or the coolness of the stone. You pour off the cloudy water a second time, and then a third. Each time, the water you pour away is a little less cloudy, a little more clear, and the blue sediment on the bottom of the bowl becomes a little more pure. The color of the sediment deepens with each washing, shifting from a grayish blue to a rich dark indigo that seems to absorb the light. You can see individual grains now, tiny, sharp-edged crystals that glitter faintly even under the water, and the amount of pale calcite mixed among them is visibly reduced. After the fourth washing, you pause and sit back on your heels, resting your hands on your thighs. The skin of your fingers is wrinkled slightly from the long immersion, and they carry a faint blue staining in the creases and around the nails, a temporary mark of the work that will fade by evening. The shallow bowl sits on the ledge, its contents now a clean, wet, granular paste of azurite, the purest blue you have yet achieved from this stone. The earthenware basin on the floor holds a quantity of pale, milky water that is already beginning to clarify as the finest particles start their slow journey to the bottom. You stand up, feeling the familiar ache in your knees and lower back from kneeling on the stone floor, and you walk a small circuit around the chapel to stretch your legs. You pass by the damp cloths on the oricio wall and check them with a brief touch. They are still moist, still doing their work. You pass by the covered mound of internaco plaster and lift the cloth just enough to see that the surface is still smooth and soft, not yet forming a skin. You pause at the high window and look out at the slice of sky visible through the thick glass, a clean, pale blue with a single wisp of cloud that has not moved in what seems like hours. The preacher's voice is a little louder now, and if you concentrate, you can almost catch the rhythm of the words, but you do not concentrate. You let the sound remain a sound, nothing more. When you return to the ledge, you bring with you a flat, smooth stone, a piece of fine-grained marble that the master uses for the final grinding of pigments. This is the porphyry slab, though it is not true porphyry, but a local white marble with a surface polished as smooth as glass. You set it on the folded sack where you kneel, and beside it you place the small brass muller, a heavy, flat-bottomed tool shaped like a small mushroom with a wide base and a short, thick stem. The glass is faintly frosted on the bottom from use, and it fits perfectly into the curve of your hand. You take the shallow bowl and tilt it very carefully to pour off the last of the wash water, leaving only the wet blue paste. Then, using a small horn spoon, you scoop the paste out of the bowl and transfer it to the center of the marble slab. The paste is thick and smooth now, the consistency of soft butter, and it holds its shape on the marble in a small, dark blue mound that glistens wetly in the light. You spread it out a little with the back of the spoon, creating a thin, even layer that covers a circle about the size of your palm, and then you set the bowl aside. Now you take up the glass muller, fitting the stem between your thumb and first two fingers, and you lower the flat base onto the blue paste. The first motion is a slow, firm outward push that spreads the paste thinner across the marble, and the sensation is a smooth, grinding drag, the fine particles of azurite rolling and crushing between the glass and the stone. You pull the muller back and push it out again in a different direction, and then you begin a slow, circular grinding motion that moves over the whole surface of the paste. The sound is a soft, wet, grinding noise, much finer and quieter than the sound of the bronze mortar, a gentle susurrus that seems to blend with the distant murmur of the crowd outside. The grinding continues for a long, unhurried time. You move the muller in steady circles, pausing occasionally to scrape the paste back into the center with a horn spoon, then spreading it out again and resuming the circular motion. The blue paste becomes smoother and smoother under the glass, the last remaining coarse grains breaking down into microscopic particles that will float in the binder and spread evenly on the wet plaster. The color seems to intensify as you grind, becoming more luminous, more pure, as if the act of grinding releases some inner light that was trapped in the stone. Your shoulder begins to ache with a dull, steady warmth, and you shift your position slightly, moving your weight from one knee to the other, but you do not stop. The rhythm of the grinding has become as natural as breathing, a slow, circular meditation that fills your mind with a calm blue emptiness. The preacher's voice rises and falls outside. The crowd murmurs and grows quiet. The pigeons coo on the roof, and you grind the azurite on the marble slab, turning the precious stone into something finer than dust. At last you lift the muller and set it aside, and you lean close to examine the paste. It is perfectly smooth now, with no visible grains, no grittiness when you rub a tiny amount between your thumb and forefinger. The color is a deep, saturated blue that seems to glow even in the dim chapel light, a blue that holds within it all the slow hours of grinding and washing, all the patience and care of the morning's work. You know that when this paste is mixed with the egg binder and applied to the damp intonaco, it will become permanent, a blue that will last for centuries without fading. The same blue that adorns the robes of the Virgin in the old fresco on the opposite wall. You take up the horn spoon again and carefully scrape every trace of the blue paste off the marble slab, gathering it into a small neat mound on the center of the stone. Then you transfer the paste to a small glass jar with a cork stopper, the jar that the master keeps specifically for the most precious pigments. You add a thin layer of clean water on top of the paste to keep it from drying out, and you press the cork firmly into the neck of the jar. The earthenware basin on the floor has been settling all this time, and you kneel beside it to check the progress. The water is much clearer now, and you can see a thin layer of pale blue sediment on the bottom of the basin, a fine velvety deposit that looks like the bloom on a plum. This is the finest fraction of the azurite, particles so small that they will create a transparent, luminous blue when mixed with the binder, perfect for the subtle highlights and shadows of the Virgin's robe. You will leave the basin to settle further, and tomorrow or the next day you will carefully pour off the clear water and collect this precious sediment. You stand and wash your hands in the water barrel, scrubbing the blue stains from your fingers with a scrap of pumice until your skin is clean and pink. You wash the horn spoon, the shallow bowl, the glass muller, and the marble slab, pouring the rinse water into the settling basin so that no color is lost. Then you dry everything with a clean rag and return each item to its place in the alcove, the muller wrapped in its soft cloth, the marble slab leaning against the wall, the spoon in the small clay pot with the other small tools, the glass jar with the finished azurite paste you carry to the locked chest, and you set it gently inside, beside the remaining fragments of raw lapis lazuli. The jar makes a small solid sound as it touches the wooden base of the chest, and you close the lid carefully, but you do not lock it because the master will need access to the pigment soon. The key remains on its peg, and you leave it there, Now you stand in the center of the chapel, your hands clean and still, the work of the washing and grinding complete. The morning has passed into early afternoon, and the light from the high windows has shifted angle again, falling now on a different section of the floor, where a warm circular indentation in the limestone marks the spot where generations of kneeling monks have rested. The crowd outside has quieted somewhat, the preacher's voice now intermittent, pausing for longer intervals between phrases. A single bell rings somewhere in the city, a thin, bright note that rises and fades. You walk to the wooden bench and sit down, feeling the tiredness in your arms and shoulders settle into a warm, comfortable heaviness. The chapel is quiet except for the soft hiss of the oil lamps and the distant rhythmic call of the doves in the bell tower. You close your eyes, and behind your lids you see blue, a deep, luminous blue that swirls and settles like the pigment in the washing bowl, a color that has imprinted itself on your sight from the long hours of patient work. The smell of the lime plaster and the oil lamps and the faint, metallic scent of bronze mingle in the air around you, and the stone wall behind your back is cool and solid. You rest there without sleeping, letting the quiet of the chapel fill you, waiting for the next small thing that the afternoon will bring. The quiet of the chapel after the grinding was a deep, settled stillness that seemed to have its own texture, like the cool side of a pillow, and you rested within it on the wooden bench with your hands folded loosely in your lap. The faint blue staining around your fingernails had faded to a pale shadow, and the ache in your shoulder had softened into a warm, distant memory of effort. You did not know how long you sat there, for time in the chapel moved in its own unhurried way, marked only by the slow progression of the sunbeam across the limestone floor and the occasional deep note of the monastery bell. The preacher's voice outside had become so constant that it was no longer a separate sound, but a part of the general murmur of the city, like the wind in the cloister cypress trees or the distant, never-ending whisper of the river. The side door opened with its familiar silent swing, and the master stepped into the chapel, his soft leather shoes making a light, brushing sound on the stone flags. He was a man of middle years, with a calm, weathered face and hands that were permanently stained at the fingertips with ochre and terra verta, and the deep blue of azurite. His tunic was a simple grey-brown wool, patched at the elbows, and he wore a leather apron that had been spattered so many times with plaster and paint that it had become a kind of abstract map of all the frescoes he had ever worked on. He nodded to you, a small, unhurried inclination of his head, and you rose from the bench without any need for words. The master walked first to the covered mound of intonaco plaster, lifting the damp cloth with a careful hand and peering at the pale grey mixture beneath. He pressed the surface very gently with the pad of his thumb, feeling the consistency, the resistance, the slight spring of the lime that told him whether the plaster was too wet, too dry, or just right. Then he let the cloth fall back into place and turned to inspect the Ariccio wall, running his palm over the moist brown surface with the same thoughtful gentleness. He hummed a single low note, a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a tune, and then he looked up at the high window where the sun was, now a bright, warm rectangle of gold on the opposite wall. The giornata, he said quietly, would be the area around the Virgin's head and shoulders, the most sacred and demanding part of the composition, because the face must be painted while the plaster is perfectly fresh and receptive. He gestured with one hand, tracing an invisible shape on the Ariccio surface, a rectangle that was perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet high, and you saw in your mind the line of the Virgin's veil, the gentle curve of her cheek, the downcast eyes that would look toward the Christ-child in the scene below. You had seen the preparatory drawings, the synopy on the Ariccio that had been sketched in red earth pigment before the first plaster was laid, and you knew this section well. You brought the fresh intonaco plaster from its resting place, carrying the wooden board carefully with both hands, because the mound, though not heavy, was precious and needed to be kept smooth. The master climbed the wooden scaffold that stood against the wall, a sturdy construction of thick planks and cross-brace legs that had been built specifically for this fresco cycle. The scaffold creaked very slightly under his weight, a low, woody sound that was as familiar as the chapel bell, and he settled himself on the upper platform with his legs dangling over the edge. You handed up the board of plaster first, and he took it and set it beside him on the platform. Then you climbed up yourself, carrying the small wooden trowel and a bucket of clean water and a few clean rags tucked into your belt. The scaffold platform was wide enough for two people to work side by side, and it gave you a new perspective on the chapel. From up here, the nave seemed longer. The vaulted ceiling closer and the oil lamps near the altar looked like tiny distant flames floating in a sea of dim air. You could see the tops of the high windows where the glass was thick and uneven, full of small bubbles and ripples that distorted the sky outside into shifting, watery shapes. The Artistry wall was directly in front of you now, its rough brown surface filling your field of vision, and you could smell the damp mineral scent of it more strongly at this close distance. The master took up a small, sharp, pointed stick of charcoal and, with a few quick, sure strokes, marked the exact boundaries of the day's giornata on the artistry surface. The lines were simple and clean, a rectangle with one slightly curved edge where the Virgin's veil would flow, and he stepped back to look at them, tilting his head first one way and then the other. Satisfied, he nodded again and gestured toward the board of plaster. You knelt on the scaffold platform, feeling the rough grain of the planks through the fabric of your hose, and you set the water bucket and the rags within easy reach. Then you took up the small wooden trowel, its blade worn to a soft, silky smoothness, and you scooped a portion of the intonaco plaster from the board. The plaster was cool and dense, and it clung to the trowel with a perfect, creamy adherence, exactly as it should. You turned to the wall and, beginning at the upper left corner of the marked rectangle, you pressed the plaster against the artistry and drew the trowel downward in a single, steady stroke. The intonaco spread across the rough brown surface in a thin, even layer, its pale grey-white colour a stark contrast to the darker artistry beneath. You worked with a slow, rhythmic motion, loading the trowel, pressing it to the wall, and drawing it down, each stroke overlapping the previous one by a small amount, so that the plaster formed a continuous, seamless skin. The sound was a soft, wet, spreading noise, a gentle shushing like a wave sliding up a sandy beach, and then retreating, repeated again and again. The plaster smelled clean and cool, the scent of lime and river sand combined, and it left a faint, pleasant tightness on the skin of your hands. The master watched without speaking, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes moving slowly over your work. From time to time he made a small gesture with one finger, indicating a spot that needed a little more plaster, or an edge that should be smoothed more carefully, and you adjusted your strokes accordingly. The rhythm of the trowel became a quiet meditation, a steady back and forth of loading and spreading, that filled your mind with a calm, white emptiness. The distant murmur of the preacher's voice continued outside, a sound so constant and so far away that it seemed to come from another world entirely. You worked your way down from the top of the giornata to the bottom, moving the trowel in long, smooth passes that left the plaster surface as flat and even as the surface of a still pond. When the main area was covered, you went back over it with a lighter touch, using the edge of the trowel to gently smooth out any small ridges or irregularities. The plaster began to glisten slightly as the moisture rose to the surface, a fine silvery sheen that caught the light from the high window and made the whole giornata glow with a soft, pearly luster. You held the trowel at a very shallow angle and passed it over the surface one last time, a final, feather, light stroke that erased the last tiny imperfections and left the plaster as smooth as polished ivory. Now you took up a small, stiff brush made of hob bristles, its short, pale hairs bound tightly with copper wire to a wooden handle, and you dipped it very lightly in the bucket of clean water. You used this brush to clean the edges of the giornata, running the damp bristles along the boundary between the fresh intonaco and the older artistry, removing any small smears or drips of plaster that had strayed beyond the charcoal lines. The bristles made a faint, scratchy sound against the wall, a crisp, delicate noise that was very different from the soft shushing of the trowel. When the edges were clean, you sat back on your heels and set the trowel and the brush aside. The giornata was complete now, a perfect rectangle of smooth, pale plaster that seemed to hold the light within itself, waiting for the touch of the brush. The surface was still damp, still open, still receptive, and it would remain so for several hours, during which time the master would lay in the colours that would bond permanently with the lime and become part of the wall itself. You felt the quiet satisfaction of a task done well, a feeling that was not excitement or pride, but simply the calm recognition that the plaster was exactly as it should be. The master leaned forward and inspected the giornata closely, his face only a few inches from the wet surface. He looked at it from one angle, then another, checking for any unevenness, any trapped air bubbles, any flecks of unsifted sand that might mar the smoothness. He found none. He straightened up and gave you a single, slow nod, the kind of nod that meant the work was good and nothing more needed to be said. Then he reached behind him and lifted a large sheet of heavy paper from the scaffold platform, unrolling it carefully with both hands. This was the cartoon, the full-size preparatory drawing that the master had made weeks ago in his workshop, working with charcoal and chalk on thick, cream-colored paper. The cartoon showed the Virgin's head and shoulders in precise, flowing lines, the gentle oval of her face, the soft curve of her lowered eyelids, the delicate arch of her brow, the fall of her veil over her hair, and the suggestion of a halo that would later be added in gold leaf. The drawing was not shaded or colored, but only outlined, a map of shapes that would guide the painting. Along every line of the drawing, the master had pricked tiny holes with a fine needle, holes so small that they were almost invisible unless you held the paper up to the light. The master positioned the cartoon against the wet plaster, aligning its edges with the boundaries of the giornata, and he held it in place with one hand spread flat against the paper. The cartoon covered the fresh plaster entirely, its cream surface a blank field waiting to be transferred. You took up the small cloth bag that had been prepared for this purpose, a square of loosely woven linen filled with finely powdered charcoal dust, and you tied its neck tightly with a short piece of cord. The bag was soft and pliable in your hand, and when you pressed it, a tiny puff of black dust escaped through the weave and hung in the air for a moment before settling. The master nodded for you to begin, and you started at the upper left corner of the cartoon, dabbing the cloth bag gently against the paper with a light tapping motion. The charcoal dust passed through the tiny pricked holes and landed on the wet plaster beneath, leaving a series of small dark dots. You worked your way slowly across the cartoon, moving from left to right, top to bottom, dabbing the bag with a steady, rhythmic beat. The sound was a soft, muffled pat, 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 as regular as a slow heartbeat, and the dots accumulated on the plaster beneath the paper like a constellation of tiny, dark stars. The master moved his hand as you progressed, holding the cartoon flat and still, ensuring that it did not shift or wrinkle against the damp surface. His face was calm and focused, his eyes fixed on the paper with the quiet attention of someone who has done this 100 times and knows that the success of the whole fresco depends on this simple, patient transfer. The preacher's voice outside swelled for a moment, a long rising phrase that carried through the high windows, and then it faded again into the general murmur of the crowd. Neither you nor the master paid it any mind. Your world was the small rectangle of paper and the tiny black dots that were appearing one by one on the plaster beneath. You reached the lower right corner of the cartoon and gave a final few dabs to the edge of the drawing, then stepped back and lowered the cloth bag. The master carefully peeled the cartoon away from the plaster, lifting it from the bottom edge first and rolling it slowly upward so that it did not drag across the wet surface. As the paper came away, the ghostly dotted outline was revealed on the fresh intonaco, a perfect, delicate tracing made of fine charcoal dots that mapped the contours of the Virgin's face and veil and robe. The lines were faint, like the first sketch of frost on a winter window, but they were clear and precise. You could see the gentle downward slope of the Virgin's shoulder, the soft fall of the veil across her forehead, the small curled shape of the Christ child's hand where it would reach up to touch her face in the scene below, a detail that extended just into the edge of this giornata. The dots were regularly spaced, each one a tiny dark seed from which the painted line would grow when the master took up his brush. The plaster was still damp and glistening, and the charcoal dots sat on its surface like small dark jewels scattered on pale silk. The master rolled the cartoon carefully and set it aside on the scaffold platform, then stood back to look at the dotted outline with a long, appraising gaze. He made a small adjustment in his mind, a slight shifting of the composition that only he could see, and he murmured something under his breath that you did not catch. Then he turned to you and gestured that the plaster work was done, that the giornata was ready, that the painting could begin when he had prepared his brushes and his palette of colors. You gathered up the trowel and the brush and the empty plasterboard, and you climbed down from the scaffold, moving slowly and carefully on the wooden rungs. The chapel floor felt solid and cool under your feet after the slightly swaying platform of the scaffold, and you carried the tools to the water barrel for cleaning. The small wooden trowel was coated with a thin layer of dried plaster at the edges, and you submerged it in the water, rubbing the blade gently with a scrap of rough cloth until the wood was clean and smooth again. The plaster residue clouded the water briefly, a pale, milky swirl that slowly settled to the bottom of the bucket. You dried the trowel with a clean rag and hung it back on its hook, and you did the same for the hog bristle brush, working the water through the short, stiff hairs to remove every trace of plaster before shaking it dry and setting it on the ledge. The plasterboard was wiped clean with a damp rag, its surface smoothed and dried, and you leaned it against the wall near the work area in case the master needed more plaster later for small patches or repairs. The bucket of dirty water you carried out to the yard, pouring it onto the packed earth where it sank in quickly and left a small dark wet circle that would dry to a faint white stain by evening. When you returned to the chapel, the light had shifted again, the sunbeam now a long golden rectangle that stretched across the nave and touched the base of the altar, lighting up the tarnished brass candlestick with a warm, mellow glow. The master had climbed down from the scaffold and was standing near the altar, opening a small wooden case that held his brushes, selecting each one with the slow consideration of a craftsman choosing the right tool for a delicate task. The dotted outline of the Virgin's face glowed softly on the wall above, patient and still, waiting for the first touch of color. He stood for a moment in the center of the chapel, your hands clean and empty, and you breathed the cool, plaster-scented air, feeling the calm, steady tiredness of a morning spent in slow and useful work. The dotted outline of the Virgin's face rested on the damp intonaco like a constellation of tiny dark stars, patient and still, and the master stood near the altar with his wooden brush case open on the stone ledge. You watched him for a moment as he selected his tools, his fingers moving among the brushes with the same calm certainty that a scribe uses when choosing a quill. Then you turned away because your own next task was waiting in the small alcove where the binder ingredients was stored. A task that required a different kind of attention, but the same slow, careful rhythm that had carried you through the morning. The alcove was a shallow niche in the thick chapel wall, its stone shelves cool and dark, and on those shelves rested a collection of small clay pots, glass jars and stoppered bottles that held the materials for making tempera. You knew each container by its shape and its place on the shelf, the way you knew the weight of your own tools. There was the jar of linseed oil that had been standing in a sunny window for weeks until it turned the color of pale honey and threw off a fine golden sediment. And there was the small corked bottle of clear vinegar that smelled sharp and clean. There was a covered dish that held fresh eggs brought up from the convent kitchen that very morning by a novice who had placed them on the shelf without a word. And there was the glass stirring rod and the small ceramic cup that you would use for mixing. You gathered these things one by one, carrying them to the low wooden table that stood near the window where the light was brightest at this hour. You set the cup in the center of the table, placed the glass rod beside it on a folded cloth so it would not roll, and arranged the oil and the vinegar and the small pitcher of water so that they stood in a neat row. Then you took one of the fresh eggs from the covered dish, holding it gently in the palm of your hand, and you felt its slight weight and the smooth, warm curve of its shell. The first step was the separation of the yolk from the white, and this was a small act of precision that you had performed so many times it had become a habit stored in your fingers. You cracked the egg sharply against the rim of the ceramic cup, a quick, clean tap that split the shell neatly into two halves. The clear, slippery white began to run out at once, and you caught it in one half of the shell while the yolk settled into the other half. A bright, orange, gold globe that glistened in the light from the window. The white you poured off into a small bowl that you would later give to the novice for use in the kitchen. It was not needed for the binder. The yolk you tipped gently from one half shell to the other, rolling it carefully so that the last clinging traces of white pulled away and the yolk remained clean and whole, its membrane taut and shining. Then you took up a fresh scrap of linen cloth, clean and dry, and you laid it flat across the palm of your left hand. You tipped the yolk very gently onto the center of the cloth, and you folded the edges of the linen up around it so that the yolk sat in a small, soft pouch. You lifted the cloth and held it over the ceramic cup, and then you squeezed the bottom of the pouch very carefully, pressing the yolk upward within its cloth wrapping. The membrane stretched and then yielded, and the liquid center of the yolk burst through in a single smooth stream that poured into the cup below. The empty membrane and the small amount of remaining white stay behind in the cloth, and you set the cloth aside on the table. The yolk in the cup was a deep, warm orange, thick and opaque, and it smelled very faintly of something rich and alive, a scent that was almost not a scent at all. Now you reached for the small glass stirring rod, a slender, perfectly smooth cylinder of pale glass that was cool and weighty in your fingers. You lowered it into the cup and began to stir the yolk with a slow, gentle, circular motion, watching the thick liquid move and swirl. At first it was heavy and resistant, but as you stirred it became more fluid, the strands of yolk breaking down into a smooth, even consistency. You stirred until the surface of the yolk was perfectly flat and still the moment you stopped moving the rod, and then you added a small measure of water from the pitcher, pouring it in a thin, controlled stream. The water curled into the yolk in pale, swirling tendrils, and you stirred again, blending the two liquids together until they formed a single, uniform, slightly lighter orange. Next came a few drops of the clear vinegar, a sharp, astringent tang that cut through the mild scent of the egg and helped the binder to remain stable and resist spoiling during the long days of painting. You let the vinegar fall drop by drop from the tip of the glass rod, canting silently to yourself, and you stirred it in gently with the same slow, circular motion. Then you reached for the jar of linseed oil, the golden liquid that had been standing for weeks in its sun-warmed window, and you poured a careful measure into the cup. The oil floated on the surface of the yolk mixture at first, a pale amber pool that refused to combine, and you brought the glass stirring rod into motion again, a little more vigorously now, working the oil into the watery yolk with a steady, patient rhythm. The stirring was the longest part of the process, a smooth, repetitive motion that made the muscles of your wrist flex and relax in a gentle, hypnotic pattern. You watched the mixture in the cup as it slowly changed, the separate elements breaking down and combining, the oil and the water and the yolk merging into a single, unified emulsion. The color shifted from deep orange to pale gold, and the texture thickened from thin and watery to a smooth, silky, milky consistency that coated the glass rod with a thin, even film. When you lifted the rod, the binder dripped off the tip in slow, fat drops that fell back into the cup with a soft, liquid pat, and the surface of the emulsion held the mark of the rod for a moment before smoothing itself out. You set the stirring rod aside on the folded cloth and picked up the cup, holding it up to the light from the window. The binder was a warm, translucent gold, the color of morning sunlight through a thin linen curtain, and it was perfectly smooth, with no streaks of oil, no specks of unmixed yolk, no separation of elements. It smelled faintly of egg and a hint of oil and a clean, sharp memory of vinegar, a scent that was fresh and mild and not at all unpleasant. You set the cup down carefully on the table where the binder would stand and rest and remain stable, ready for the master when he began to mix his colors. Outside, the distant murmur of the crowd had been a constant presence all morning, a low, woven hum that rose and fell like the breathing of a large, patient animal, and through that murmur the preacher's voice still carried in rhythmic, undulating waves. His cadence had become very familiar now, a pattern of long, sustained notes followed by shorter, sharper phrases, with pauses between them that seemed to hold the crowd in a kind of suspended stillness. The sound drifted through the high windows as a wash of pure tone, the individual words still too far away to be understood, and it mingled with the scent of the egg binder and the coolness of the stone walls, until it became simply another part of the chapel's atmosphere. You did not pause to listen, but the sound was there all the same, a distant, unobtrusive thread woven through the quiet of your work. You turned your attention now to the small wooden case that sat on a shelf near the pigment chest, a flat, shallow box with a hinged lid that the master used for storing the mussel shells that served as his palette. You lifted the lid and looked inside. The shells were arranged in neat rows, each one a different size and shape, their inner surfaces cleaned and polished to a soft pearly sheen. Some were no bigger than your thumbnail, suitable for a few strokes of a single color, while others were as broad as the palm of your hand, wide and shallow, perfect for the large areas of drapery that the master would lay in today. You selected a half-dozen shells of various sizes, and you carried them to the work area, setting them out in a row on the stone ledge beside the cup of binder. Now came the pigments. You went first to the locked chest, where the glass jar of azurite paste was resting, and you lifted it out with both hands. The paste inside was exactly as you had left it, a thick, smooth, dark blue mound covered with a thin layer of clear water to keep it moist. You set the jar on the ledge beside the mussel shells, and then you went back to the alcove to collect the other pigments that the master would need. There was a small clay pot of yellow ochre, a warm, earthy color that had been ground and washed weeks ago, and now sat as a firm, dense paste under a layer of water. There was a folded paper packet of verdigris green, the bright, sharp color that came from copper plates exposed to vinegar fumes, a pigment that had to be handled carefully because of its corrosive nature. There was a small jar of burnt umber, a deep, rich brown made from earth that had been heated until it turned dark and intense. And there was a tiny ceramic pot of lead white, dense and heavy and opaque, the brightest white in the master's palette. You carried these pigments to the ledge one by one and arranged them in the order they would be used. A spectrum from white through yellow and brown to green and blue, the same order the master always followed. The row of mussel shells sat below them like empty bowls waiting to be filled, their interiors glowing softly in the light. The master had finished selecting his brushes and now approached the ledge, his footsteps quiet on the stone floor. He carried a handful of soft squirrel hair brushes of various sizes, their pale bristles bound with silk thread to slender wooden handles, and a few stiffer hog bristle brushes for the broader areas. He laid these down on the clean rag you had spread beside the shells, and then he stood for a moment looking at the arrangement of pigments and binder, his eyes moving slowly from one item to the next, as if you were reading a page of very small, very familiar text. He picked up the cup of binder first and swirled it gently, watching the golden liquid climb the sides of the cup and slide back down. Satisfied, he set it down and reached for the small jar of azurite paste. He poured off the thin layer of water that covered the paste, letting it fall into the settling basin on the floor, with a soft, trickling sound. And then he scooped out a portion of the blue paste with a small horn spoon and transferred it to the largest of the mussel shells. The paste sat in the shell, a dark, glossy mound that looked almost black in the dim light, but you knew that as soon as it was mixed with the binder, it would bloom into that deep, luminous blue. The master added a few drops of the egg binder to the azurite paste, and then he began to work the two together with a small, stiff brush that he kept specifically for this purpose. The brush moved in tight, small circles, blending the blue pigment into the golden medium, and the color began to change at once, lightening and brightening, the deep indigo shifting into a rich, glowing ultramarine that seemed to catch all the light in the chapel and throw it back in a concentrated, jewel-like spark. The master worked patiently, adding more binder drop by drop, testing the consistency by lifting the brush and watching the color flow off the bristles in a smooth, even stream. The blue had to be thin enough to spread easily on the damp plaster, but thick enough to hold its color and not become watery and weak. Beside the master, you took up your own smaller mussel shell and your own small brush, and you began to prepare the other colors according to the same method. You scooped a little of the yellow ochre into a shell, added a few drops of binder, and worked the brush in slow circles until the color was a warm, buttery gold. The burnt umber you mixed next, its dark, rich brown lifting into a softer, warmer shade as the binder blended with it. The verdigris green you handled with particular care, using a separate brush that you would wash immediately afterward, and you mixed only a small amount, because the color was so intense that a little went a very long way. The lead white was the last, and you blended it into a thick, creamy paste that was as smooth and opaque as fresh milk. The master worked alongside you in silence, his hands moving with a practiced, economical grace, his attention fully absorbed in the small, precise task of mixing. The preacher's voice outside had softened now, dropping into a lower, more conversational pitch, and the crowd murmur had faded somewhat, as if the people listening had settled into a deeper stillness. A single dove called from the bell tower, a long, low, throaty coo that carried through the high window and hung in the air for a moment before fading. When the colors were ready, the row of mussel shells glowed on the ledge like a jeweler's display, each one holding its small pool of luminous color, the deep blue of the azurite, the warm gold of the ochre, the dark brown of the umber, the bright green of the verdigris, and the pure cream of the lead white. The binder cup sat among them, still half full, its golden contents gleaming softly. The master surveyed the palette with a quiet, satisfied expression, and then he picked up his largest squirrel hair brush and turned toward the scaffold. You followed him up the wooden rungs, carrying the row of mussel shells carefully in both hands so that the colors did not spill. The scaffold received you with its familiar slight sway, and you set the shells out on a flat plank that the master had fitted to the platform as a shelf. The giornata glistened softly on the wall before you, its surface still damp and receptive, the dotted charcoal outline of the Virgin's face and veil, waiting like a promise about to be fulfilled. The master dipped the tip of his brush into the mussel shell of azurite, and the fibers drank up the blue with a soft, eager absorption. He held the loaded brush above the plaster for a moment, his hand perfectly steady, and then he lowered it to the wall. Meanwhile, you had small, quiet tasks of your own. You collected the used mixing brushes and the empty pigment jars and the cloth with the yolk membrane, and you carried them down from the scaffold for cleaning. The brushes you rinsed in the water bucket, working the binder out of the bristles with gentle squeezes, watching the colored water swirl and cloud. The cloth you folded and set aside for the novice to take to the laundry. The jars you wiped clean with a rag and returned to their places on the alcove shelf. Everything was put back in order, the same order it had held that morning, as if the mixing had left no trace behind. When you finished cleaning, you stood for a moment at the base of the scaffold, looking up at the master as he worked. His brush moved slowly across the plaster, laying in the first broad area of the Virgin's robe, with a calm, unhurried stroke. The blues spread across the damp intonaco in a smooth, even band, sinking into the lime and becoming part of the wall even as you watched. The color was luminous, a deep, pure ultramarine that seemed to glow from within, the same blue that you had seen emerge from the crushed stone in the washing water and the long grinding on the marble slab. It was the color of the sky just after sunset, the color of the sea in a deep bay, the color that had traveled thousands of miles in the hold of a ship, and then in the pouch of a merchant, and then in the locked chest of the chapel. All to arrive here, on this wall, in this quiet moment, under the steady hand of the master. You turned away and walked back to the alcove, where you sat down on the low stool and let your hands rest on your knees. The smell of the egg binder still lingered in the air, a faint, warm, living scent that was slowly giving way to the clean mineral smell of the wet plaster and the dry, dusty scent of the pigments. The chapel was quiet, except for the soft, distant sound of the brush on the wall and the occasional shift of the master's weight on the scaffold planks. The distant voice of the preacher continued to rise and fall outside, but it was very faint now, as if the speaker had moved to the far side of the piazza, or the crowd had grown so still that even their murmuring had ceased. The afternoon was deepening, and the light through the high windows was beginning to take on the first faint golden tinge of evening, though evening was still hours away. You closed your eyes and listened to the small, peaceful sounds of the chapel, and you waited for whatever the next hour would bring. The small glass jar of prepared azurite paste rested inside the locked chest, and the fresh giornata waited on the wall above the scaffold, with its faint charcoal dots mapping the Virgin's downcast eyes and the soft curve of her veil. The master had returned from the altar with his wooden brush case and had climbed back onto the scaffold to sit cross-legged on the platform, studying the dotted outline with a quiet, unhurried attention, while the plaster continued to settle into its perfect state of damp receptiveness. Now there was a pause in the rhythm of the day, a natural stopping place where the preparation ended and the painting had not yet begun. And it was in this pause that the master looked down at you and gestured toward the folded sack near the work area where the midday meal was kept. You walked to the corner of the chapel where a small wooden crate sat against the wall, a plain box of rough pine that had once held pigment jars from Venice, and now served as a seat and a table and a storage place all at once. On top of the crate you had placed the cloth sack early that morning, a square of undyed linen tied with a leather cord, and you lifted it now and carried it toward the altar where the master had descended from the scaffold to sit on the broad stone step. The step was worn into a shallow, smooth depression, polished by the daily presence of monks and worshippers over more years than anyone could count, and it was a comfortable place to sit, because the stone had absorbed the warmth of the sunbeam that had been falling on it for the past hour. You untied the leather cord and opened the cloth sack, spreading it flat on the step like a small tablecloth. Inside were the simple things that made up the midday meal, A round loaf of coarse brown bread with a dusting of flour still on its crust, a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in a piece of clean muslin, a handful of dried figs that had been pressed flat and were sticky with their own dark sugar, and a small clay pot of olives in brine. There was also a single clay cup, its rim chipped in 2 places, and a leather bottle of water that had been filled from the barrel that morning and was still cool to the touch. The master took the bread first, breaking it into 2 roughly equal pieces with a slow, deliberate twist of his hands. The crust crackled softly, and a few fine crumbs fell onto the stone step, and he handed 1 piece to you with a small nod. The bread was dense and chewy, with a faint nutty sweetness that came from the wheat, and you ate it slowly, tearing off small pieces and letting them soften in your mouth before swallowing. The master did the same, his jaw moving in a slow, steady rhythm as he gazed across the chapel toward the high window where the sky was now a deep, cloudless blue. You unwrapped the cheese from its muslin and cut it into thick slices with the small knife from your belt, and you laid the slices on the cloth between you. The cheese was pale yellow and slightly crumbly, with a sharp, clean taste that contrasted with the sweetness of the bread. And you ate a slice very slowly, pausing between bites to look up at the frescoes on the side walls. The master took a few olives from the pot, eating them one at a time and dropping the small hard pits into the palm of his hand before placing them in a neat pile on the edge of the step. Neither of you spoke beyond the practical remarks about the plaster's drying rate and the way the charcoal dots were holding fast on the damp surface, words that were offered quietly and answered with a nod or a single syllable. The chapel had fallen into a deep midday silence. The preacher outside had stopped speaking, and the crowd in the piazza had dispersed, their footsteps fading away into the narrow streets around the convent, until there was nothing left but the occasional distant voice and the soft, rhythmic coo of the doves in the bell tower. The city was taking its own midday rest, the shops closing their wooden shutters, the vendors retreating into the shade of their awnings, the carts and the mules and the children, all pausing in the warm, still center of the afternoon. The silence inside the chapel was not an empty silence, but a full one, made of the soft hiss of the oil lamps and the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the wooden roof beams expanding in the warmth, and the tiny scratching sounds of the mouse behind the choir stalls that had resumed its quiet explorations. You finished the bread and cheese and ate 2 of the dried figs, their dark, jammy sweetness a slow pleasure that lingered on your tongue. Then you poured water from the leather bottle into the clay cup, filling it to just below the chipped rim, and you drank half of it in slow, deliberate sips before passing the cup to the master. He drank the rest and set the cup down on the step, and for a long moment neither of you moved or spoke. The spider near the altar had come out to the center of its web again and was working on something too small to see, its legs moving in a delicate, silent dance against the light. You leaned back on your hands and looked up at the high window. The pane of thick, bubbled glass distorted the sky into a shifting, watery pattern, and you could see a small cloud passing slowly across the square of blue, its edges dissolving little by little into the immensity of the afternoon. The cloud was the only thing moving in the sky, and you watched it without thinking, letting your eyes follow its slow drift until it disappeared beyond the frame of the window. The light inside the chapel changed subtly as the cloud passed, dimming for a moment to a soft greyish tone and then brightening again as the sun emerged. The master stood up slowly, brushing the crumbs from his tunic and stretching his arms above his head with a low, quiet sigh. He walked to the water barrel and dipped his hands into it, splashing water on his face and rubbing it over the back of his neck, and then he dried himself with a clean rag and walked back toward the scaffold. You gathered the remains of the meal, folding the cheese back into its muslin and tying the cloth sack closed, and you carried the clay cup to the barrel to rinse it clean. The water in the barrel was still cool and dark, and you let your hand rest in it for a moment, feeling the pleasant chill around your wrist. You did not hurry back to the scaffold. The midday pause was a recognized part of the working day, a time when the body rested and the plaster settled, and the mind turned away from the details of grinding and mixing toward a more general, peaceful awareness of the world around it. You walked a slow circuit of the chapel, your soft shoes making no more sound than a whisper on the stone flags, and you looked at the things you had seen 100 times before, but never tired of seeing. The wooden rafters of the ceiling were dark with age, their surfaces marked with the faint wavy lines of the adze that had shaped them long before you were born. Small cracks ran along some of the beams, hairline fissures that had opened and closed with the seasons over decades, and in one corner a cluster of tiny dried mud nests showed where swallows had once nested before the windows were blazed. The rafter nearest the altar had a small carved mark on its underside, a simple cross that some long-ago carpenter had cut into the wood as a blessing or a signature, or simply a habit of the hand. You walked past the side chapels where the older frescoes glowed dimly in the half-light. St. Peter Martyr with his calm round face and his faded golden halo, St. Thomas Aquinas with his book and quill, St. Dominic with his dark blue cloak and his hand raised in that gentle, eternal gesture. The fresco of the Annunciation in the smallest chapel showed the Virgin in a blue mantle that had been painted more than 100 years ago, and you paused there for a moment to study the color. It was a good blue, a deep, quiet ultramarine that had held its richness through all the years of candle smoke and damp and the slow, patient work of time. You compared it in your mind to the azurite paste you had prepared that morning, noting the subtle differences in tone and depth, the way the old blue had mellowed and softened, while your fresh blue still held the vivid intensity of newly ground stone. The spider near the altar had finished its work and was now sitting motionless at the center of its web, a tiny, patient presence that seemed as permanent as the stones themselves. You stood near the altar and looked at the web, noting its perfect geometry, the way the silk threads caught the light and turned it into fine lines of silver. A small dried leaf had blown in through the high window at some point and was caught in the corner of the web, and the spider had worked around it, incorporating the foreign object into the structure with a quiet, practical acceptance. The sacristan appeared from the sacristy door at the far end of the chapel, a silent figure in a dark habit who moved with the slow, shuffling gait of old age. He carried a small brass snuffer on a long pole, and he made his way to each of the oil lamps, pausing to check the oil level and to trim the wicks with a small pair of iron scissors that he took from a pouch at his waist. He did not acknowledge you beyond a brief, distant nod, and you did not speak to him, for there was no need. The sacristan completed his circuit of the lamps and disappeared back through the sacristy door, and the chapel was quiet again. You walked back toward the scaffold and stood at its base, looking up at the giornata. The fresh plaster was still damp, still glistening with that fine, silvery sheen, and the charcoal dots of the cartoon transfer stood out clearly against the pale surface. The outline of the Virgin's face was visible now in its entirety, the gentle oval of her cheek, the soft line of her lowered eyelid, the delicate curve of her brow, and the fall of her veil that swept down toward her shoulder like a slow, graceful gesture. The dots seemed to have settled into the plaster, their edges blurring very slightly as the moisture in the lime began to absorb the charcoal, and you knew that when the master took up his brush, the first strokes of color would merge with these dots and transform them into the permanent lines of the painting. The master had climbed back onto the scaffold and was sitting cross-legged on the platform, arranging his brushes in a neat row on a folded cloth. They were brushes of many sizes, large, soft ones made of squirrel hair for laying in broad areas of color, medium ones of hog bristle for the drapery folds, and very fine ones of miniver fur for the delicate work on the face and hands. Each brush had its own character, its own particular spring and flex, and the master tested them one by one against the back of his hand before placing them in the order he would use them. Beside the brushes, he had set out a small, shallow dish of clean water, a scrap of linen for wiping the bristles, and a wooden pallet with several small depressions carved into its surface. You climbed the scaffold quietly and sat at the edge of the platform, your legs hanging over the side, and you waited while the master continued his preparations. He had brought out the small glass jar of azurite paste from the locked chest, and he unscrewed the cork and held the jar up to the light to inspect the color. The blue paste glowed in the sunlight, a deep, luminous hue that seemed to hold within it all the hours of breaking and grinding and washing that had brought it to this state. The master nodded to himself and set the jar on the pallet, and then he reached for the small cup of egg binder that he had prepared earlier in the sacristy, a pale golden liquid that smelled faintly of vinegar and linseed oil. The mixing of the paint was a quiet, focused ritual that you had watched many times before, and you settled into your role as the silent assistant, there to hold the palette, or pass a brush or pour a little water, but mostly there to be still and attentive while the master worked. The chapel around you was calm and full of the steady, golden light of early afternoon, and the only sounds were the soft, deliberate movements of the master's hands, and the distant, rhythmic cooing of the doves, and the endless, gentle whisper of the oil lamps burning quietly near the altar. The midday rest had left your limbs heavy and warm, and when you rose from the low step near the altar, your body moved with the slow, considered pace of someone returning from a distant, peaceful place. The bread and cheese and dried figs had settled in your stomach with a comfortable weight, and the water from the clay cup had washed away the last faint taste of the morning's dust. You stretched your arms once, feeling the pull across your shoulders, and then you walked to the water barrel to splash a little cool water on your face. The water ran down your temples and dripped onto the neck of your tunic, and you dried yourself with a rag from your belt, feeling refreshed and ready for the slow, quiet hours of the afternoon. The master had returned from the refectory a few minutes before you, and he was already standing at the base of the scaffold, looking up at the giornata with his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The pastor had been resting for some time now, covered lightly with a single layer of damp cloth while the midday meal was taken, and the master reached up to peel the cloth away with a slow, careful pull. The intonaco beneath was still damp, still receptive, its surface now having the look of polished ivory that has been breathed upon, a fine, even, matte smoothness that held the light without reflecting it. The master pressed the pad of his thumb very gently against the edge of the plaster, and the slight give told him that there were still several good hours of painting time left before the giornata would begin to set and close its pores against the color. He turned to you with a small nod, the same quiet signal he always used when it was time to bring the palette and brushes up to the scaffold. You went at once to the stone ledge where the mussel shells of prepared color had been resting, each one covered with a small square of damp linen to keep the paint from drying out in the warm air. You lifted the cloths one by one and checked the contents. The deep blue azurite was still smooth and fluid. The ochre had thickened only slightly. The umber and the verdigris and the lead white were all exactly as you had left them. You gathered the shells into a small wooden tray that the master had designed for this purpose, a shallow box with low sides and a flat handle that allowed you to carry several colors at once without spilling. Then you picked up the jar of clean water and the bundle of fine brushes, and you followed the master up the scaffold steps. The scaffold creaked softly under your combined weight, a familiar, reassuring sound that meant the afternoon's work was beginning. The master settled himself on his wooden stool, the same one he always used, its seat worn to a smooth, dark polish from years of use, and he arranged his brushes in a neat row on the plank shelf. You set the wooden tray of mussel shells beside the brushes and the water jar at the far end where it would not be knocked over, and then you knelt on the scaffold platform in your usual place, slightly behind and to the left of the master, where you could see the wall clearly and reach anything he might need. The giornata glowed in the afternoon light, the dotted charcoal outline still visible beneath the thin initial wash of color that the master had laid in before the midday break. The broad area of the Virgin's mantle had been blocked in with a pale, even layer of blue, a foundation upon which the deeper folds and shadows would now be built. The master picked up his widest squirrel hair brush, a flat, soft blade of pale bristles that was as wide as 2 fingers, and he dipped it into the mussel shell of azurite, loading the brush with a generous amount of the deep blue paint. The brush came away from the shell with a soft, wet sound, and the color clung to the bristles in a thick, glossy bead that seemed to glow with its own inner light. He positioned the brush at the upper curve of the Virgin's shoulder, where the mantle would fall in a deep shadowed fold, and he drew the brush downward in a single, fluid stroke. The blue flowed off the bristles onto the damp plaster with a smooth, even spread, the color sinking into the intonaco at once and darkening slightly as the chemical bond began to form. The stroke left behind a band of color that was darker at the top where the brush first touched and lighter at the bottom where the pressure eased, a natural gradient that would become the soft shadow of the fold. The master lifted the brush and looked at the mark he had made, tilting his head slightly to one side, and then he dipped the brush again and laid another stroke beside the first, overlapping it just enough to create a seamless join. You watched the master's hand as it moved, the slow, deliberate arc of the brush, the way his wrist rotated slightly at the end of each stroke to feather the edge of the color. The sound of the brush on the plaster was very soft, a light whisking noise like a dry leaf being drawn across smooth stone, and it was the only sound in the chapel besides the distant murmur from the piazza that had returned after the midday quiet. The preacher's voice had resumed its rhythmic pattern outside, a little fainter now, as if the crowd had thinned or the speaker had grown tired, and it drifted through the open wooden doors at the far end of the nave like a breeze made of sound, never loud enough to distract but always present, a gentle, undulating backdrop to the slow work on the scaffold. The master continued to build the first fold of the mantle, laying in the deep blue shadow with a series of careful overlapping strokes that followed the contour of the Virgin's shoulder. The fold took shape gradually, a soft, curving hollow in the fabric that suggested the weight and drape of heavy cloth, without any need for sharp lines or harsh contrasts. The blue was not a single flat color, but a subtle modulation of tones, deeper in the crevice of the fold and lighter on the raised ridge, and the master achieved this by varying the pressure of his brush and the amount of pigment he loaded with each dip. Sometimes he would add a single drop of water from the jar to thin the paint, creating a more transparent wash that let the white plaster shine through and gave the fold a luminous, airy quality. The assistant's role during this work was simple and essential: to be still, to be watchful, and to be ready. You held the wooden tray of colors steady on your lap, tilting it slightly when the master reached for a different shell, so that the light fell on the paint and he could see the exact shade. From time to time he would pause and hold out his hand without looking, and you would place a clean brush into his palm, or take the used one and rinse it gently in the water jar, swirling the bristles until the blue color bled out into the water and the brush was clean and soft again. The rinse water in the jar slowly turned a pale, cloudy blue, and you would have to change it for fresh water soon, but for now it was still clear enough to serve. The fold grew under the master's brush, a deep shadowed crease that curved down from the shoulder toward the place where the Virgin's arm would later be painted. The master added a touch of burnt umber to the azurite on the palette, blending the two colors together with the tip of his brush until the blue took on a slightly warmer, deeper tone, and he used this darker mixture to deepen the very base of the fold, where the shadow would be strongest. The umber sank into the wet blue and merged with it, creating a color that was not brown and not blue, but something in between, a rich complex darkness that gave the fold its full depth and solidity. On the raised ridge of the fold, where the light would catch the fabric, the master used a lighter touch, loading his brush with a paler mix of azurite that had been thinned with a little more binder and the single brush tip of lead white. This lighter blue he feathered along the outer edge of the fold with a series of tiny, delicate strokes, almost a caress, and the color sat on the surface of the plaster with a soft, milky glow that suggested the gentle fall of light across the Virgin's shoulder. The contrast between the deep shadow and the pale highlight was not sharp or sudden, but gradual, a slow, smooth transition that made the fold look as if it were made of real cloth, heavy and soft and full of quiet grace. The master worked without speaking, his face calm and absorbed, his breathing slow and even. The smell of the wet lime plaster and the egg tempera mingled in the air around the scaffold, a clean, slightly sweet scent that was the distinctive perfume of fresco painting. The distant voice of the preacher continued to rise and fall outside, sometimes swelling for a moment on a long, drawn-out phrase, then dropping back into a low, rhythmic murmur, and the sound seemed to blend with the scent of the paint and the soft whisk of the brush until all the senses were wrapped in a single, peaceful fabric. We dipped a small brush into the water jar and used it to clean a tiny smudge of blue that had crept beyond the edge of the fold, a speck no larger than a grain of sand. But the master had taught you that every small correction mattered. The damp plaster yielded the speck easily, the color lifting away with a single gentle wipe, and the white surface beneath was pristine again. You rinsed the brush and set it aside, then returned your hands to the tray of colors, holding it steady and waiting for the next small task. The fold was nearly complete now, a deep, graceful curve of blue that swept across the upper part of the giornata with a quiet, understated beauty. The master sat back on his stool and looked at his work with a long, appraising gaze, his brush resting loosely in his hand with a dot of blue trembling on the tip. He studied the transition from shadow to light, the smoothness of the gradient, the way the fold related to the charcoal outline of the Virgin's veil above it, and the suggestion of the Christ child's hand below. Then he leaned forward and made one final tiny adjustment, a stroke so light and so brief that it was barely more than a thought, and he set his brush down on the shelf. The fold rested on the wall, its blue already beginning the slow process of drying and bonding with the lime. The color would continue to deepen and mature over the coming days and weeks, the chemical reaction between the pigment and the plaster creating a permanent crystalline surface that would last for centuries. What was now a slightly glossy, wet blue would become a matte, eternal surface, as smooth and cool as stone, the color locked into the wall forever. You looked at the fold and felt the quiet satisfaction of having witnessed the first true brushstrokes of the Virgin's robe, the moment when the pigment left the shell and became something more than colored paste. The master stood up from his stool and stretched his back, his hands pressed against his lower spine, and he let out a slow, quiet breath. The afternoon light had shifted while he worked, the sunbeam now falling on a different section of the chapel floor far below, and the high windows showed a sky that was still clear and blue, but beginning to take on the faintest suggestion of the golden hour that would come later. The master picked up a clean rag and wiped the tips of his fingers, which were stained a faint blue from the azurite, and then he gestured for you to set the palette aside for a moment. You placed the wooden tray on the shelf and stood up, feeling the stiffness in your own knees from kneeling for so long on the scaffold planks. The master pointed with one finger to the lower part of the giornata, where the charcoal outline showed the small curled shape of the Christ child's hand reaching up toward the Virgin's face. This detail, he explained in a few quiet words, would be painted next, because the plaster was still fresh enough to receive the fine, delicate lines of the fingers and the soft, pinkish tone of the child's skin. The blue mantle would continue to dry while this other work was done, and the two sections would meet at the edge of the giornata in a clean, seamless join. The master selected a much smaller brush now, a fine, pointed squirrel hair tool that came to a tip as sharp as a needle, and he reached for the mussel shell that held a pale, warm mixture of lead white and a tiny touch of ochre and a speck of vermilion that had been prepared earlier for the flesh tones. The color was a soft, creamy pink, the color of the inside of a seashell or the blush on a ripening pear, and it was thin enough to flow smoothly off the fine brush, but opaque enough to cover the grey plaster with a warm, living tone. The master bent close to the wall, his face only a few inches from the damp plaster, and he began to trace the outline of the child's tiny hand with the very tip of the brush. The fingers were curled slightly inward, the palm small and round, the wrist a delicate narrow stem, and the master painted each digit with a slow, painstaking care, one brushstroke for the index finger, another for the middle finger, a third for the ring finger, a fourth for the little finger, and a broader stroke for the thumb. The paint sank into the plaster and became part of it, the pinkish color glowing softly against the pale grey background, and the hand seemed to emerge from the wall as if it had been waiting there all along. You watched the hand take shape with a quiet sense of wonder that never grew old, no matter how many times you had seen the master work. The way the paint flowed off the brush, the way the plaster accepted it, the way the color settled and bonded and became permanent, all these things felt like a small, everyday miracle that happened so slowly and so quietly that it was easy to forget how remarkable it was. But you did not forget, not entirely. A part of you always held on to the knowledge that you were watching something rare and precious, something that would outlast the painter and the assistant and everyone who stood in this chapel. The master completed the hand and added a few tiny touches, the curve of a fingernail in a slightly paler pink, the shadow between the fingers in a faint wash of umber, the plump crease of the baby wrist in a line so fine it was barely visible. Then he sat back and let out a small, satisfied breath, and he set the fine brush down on the shelf beside the others. The preacher's voice outside had softened still further, becoming a low, rhythmic pulse that was almost indistinguishable from the wind, and the crowd murmur had faded to a thin, distant rustle. The afternoon was wearing on, and the light through the high windows was beginning to deepen into that rich golden tone that came in the hours before sunset. The chapel was very quiet now, quieter than it had been all day, and the stillness felt full and complete, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. You gathered the used brushes and the mussel shells that were no longer needed, and you climbed down from the scaffold to begin the first cleaning of the afternoon. The water in the jar had turned very blue, and you carried it carefully to the settling basin, pouring it in with the other wash water so that the precious azurite particles could be recovered later. The brushes you rinsed in the clean water bucket, working the color out of the bristles until the water ran clear, and then you shaped each brush with your fingers and laid them flat on a clean rag to dry. The wooden tray you wiped down with a damp cloth, removing the small smears of paint that had accumulated during the work, and then you set it back on the stone ledge beside the remaining pigments. When you returned to the scaffold, the master was still sitting on his stool, looking at the giornata with a quiet, contemplative expression. The blue fold and the small pink hand were drying now, their glossy wet surfaces gradually turning matte and cool, and the wall looked as if it had always held these colors, as if they had been waiting inside the plaster from the moment it was laid. The master nodded to you, a slow, satisfied nod, and then he began to gather his things, preparing to climb down for the day's final task of covering and protecting the new work. The afternoon had been a good one, slow and steady and full of careful, quiet labor, and the chapel was peaceful, as the light began its slow fade toward evening. The blue fold of the Virgin's mantle had dried to a soft, matte surface that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and the small pink hand of the Christ child glowed faintly on the lower part of the giornata like a tiny, perfect star. The master had climbed down from the scaffold for a brief rest, sitting on the wooden bench near the altar with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes closed. Not sleeping, but simply resting his sight after the long, focused work on the fine details. You left him there in his quiet repose, and turned your attention to the next small task that was waiting, a task that had been mentioned in passing with a few quiet words and a gesture toward the storage alcove. The decorative border beneath the main scene was a frieze of stylized leaves and small vases, a repeating pattern that would run along the lower edge of the fresco like a woven ribbon of green and gold. The master had decided that this border should be painted next, while the plaster was still damp enough to receive the color but firm enough to hold the precise, repetitive shapes of the ornament. The border was not the Sacred Heart of the fresco, not the Virgin's face or the Christ child's hand, but it was the frame that would hold the whole composition together, and it required a different kind of attention, patient, rhythmic, almost meditative in its steady repetition. You walked to the storage alcove and knelt beside the low shelf where the earth pigments were kept in their clay pots and linen bags. The pigment you needed was terra verte, the green earth that came from the hills near Verona and had been used by fresco painters since the old Roman times. It was a soft, muted green, the color of sage leaves and grey olives, and it was prized for its stability and its gentle, understated beauty. You found the small clay pot with its waxed cloth cover, and you lifted it down from the shelf, feeling the familiar weight of the dry pigment inside. Beside the pot of green earth you gathered the other things you would need, the small bronze mortar that you had used for the azurite, now cleaned and polished and ready for a new color, and the glass muller on its folded cloth, and the porphyry slab that would serve as the grinding surface. You also took a fresh mussel shell from the box on the shelf, a medium-sized one with a deep, smooth hollow that would hold enough green paint for the border work. These items you carried to the work area near the window where the light was still bright and clear, and you arranged them in a neat semicircle on the stone floor. The grinding of terra verte was different from the grinding of lapis lazuli in almost every way. The green earth was not a precious stone, but a soft, crumbly clay that broke apart easily and yielded its color without resistance. There was no need for the hammer and chisel, no careful sorting of pure fragments from impure ones, no long washing to remove the finest particles. The pigment was simply scooped from the pot as a dry, pale grey-green powder and poured into the bronze mortar in a single, soft, rushing stream that made a faint, sandy sound against the metal. You picked up the pestle and began to grind the green earth in slow, easy circles. The sound was a soft, gritty crunch, much quieter and smoother than the sharp crackling of the lapis, and the dry powder moved under the pestle with a fluid, almost silky motion. The color began to intensify as you ground, the pale grey-green shifting into a deeper, warmer shade, the color of moss on a shaded stone or the underside of an olive leaf. A fine, pale dust rose from the mortar, not the bright blue haze of the azurite, but a soft, earthy cloud that smelled faintly of dry clay and something that was almost like the scent of rain on summer ground. You ground the pigment, until it was as fine as you could make it with the bronze mortar alone. And then you poured the powder out onto the porphyry slab, spreading it in a thin, even layer. The green powder lay on the dark stone like a patch of pale lichen, and you took up the glass muller and began the final, finest grinding. The muller moved in slow, steady circles, and the powder beneath it became finer and finer, the individual grains breaking down into microscopic particles that would float smoothly in the binder and spread evenly on the plaster. The grinding was not strenuous, not like the long, patient work on the azurite. It was a gentle, rhythmic motion that occupied your hands, while your mind drifted in a calm, green-tinged quiet. Outside, the preacher's voice had become a continuous, low undulation, so constant and so rhythmic that it was no longer possible to separate it from the other sounds of the city. It rose and fell with the same slow, steady pulse as the wind in the cypress trees or the distant murmur of the river, and the crowd's responses had faded to a thin, occasional rustle that might have been nothing more than the stirring of pigeons on the roof tiles. The late afternoon light had begun to take on that warm golden quality that comes in the hours before sunset, and the high windows cast long, quiet shadows across the nave floor, shadows that moved very slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the sun tracked its ancient course. When the green pigment was fine enough, you scooped it into the mussel shell, and added a few drops of the egg binder from the small cup that the master had left on the ledge. The dry powder drank up the binder eagerly, darkening to a rich wet green, and you worked the two together with a small stiff brush, blending them into a smooth glossy paste that was the exact consistency of heavy cream. The color was beautiful in its quiet way, a muted, natural green that would form a gentle frame for the deep blue of the Virgin's mantle and the warm pink of the Christ child's skin, never competing for attention, but always supporting, always holding the composition together, with its steady, understated presence. You carry the mussel shell of green paint up the scaffold and set it on the shelf beside the other colors. The master had risen from his rest and was already on the platform, studying the lower section of the giornata where the border would be painted. He had a small fine brush in his hand, and he was tracing the faint charcoal guidelines that marked the repeating pattern of leaves, a series of delicate, curving arcs that flowed from left to right across the bottom of the plaster. The pattern was simple and graceful, each leaf a slender, pointed oval that curved slightly at the tip, each small vase a rounded form that sat between the leaves like a small, patient bird. The master took the shell of green paint and began to fill in the first leaf, his brush moving with a slow, steady, repetitive stroke that was quite different from the fluid, varied motion of the drapery work. The border required precision and consistency, each leaf as identical to the last as the human hand could make it, and the master worked with a patient, unhurried concentration, dipping the brush, filling the leaf, cleaning the edge, and moving on to the next. The green paint lay on the plaster in a thin, even film, and it sank into the damp intonaco with the same ready acceptance that the blue had shown, the color bonding permanently to the lime as it dried. While the master worked on the border, you descended from the scaffold to begin the careful work of cleaning the tools that had been used for the azurite earlier in the day. The bronze mortar and pestle, the glass muller, the porphyry slab, the small horn spoon, the ceramic washing bowl, all of these had traces of the precious blue pigment still clinging to their surfaces, and each trace had to be recovered and saved. You carried the items to the water barrel one by one, and you set up a small cleaning station on the stone floor with the settling basin and a pitcher of clean water and several clean rags. The bronze mortar you rinsed first, pouring a small amount of water into its bowl and swirling it around with a circular motion of your wrist. The rinse water turned a pale, milky blue at once, the color of a thin winter sky, and you poured it carefully into the settling basin where the fine azurite particles would slowly sink and accumulate over the coming days. You repeated this process 3 times, swirling and pouring until the rinse water ran clear, and the inside of the mortar gleamed with its dark, golden shine. Then you dried the mortar thoroughly with a clean rag, rubbing the bronze until it was warm and bright, and you set it back on its shelf in the alcove. The pestle received the same careful attention, its rounded end carrying a faint blue bloom that lifted away with the first touch of water and swirled into the settling basin in pale, cloudy tendrils. You dried the pestle and placed it beside the mortar, and then you turned to the glass muller. The flat base of the muller had a thin, almost invisible film of blue that had dried into the microscopic scratches on the glass, and you had to rub it gently with a wet finger to loosen the color before rinsing it into the basin. The water swirled pale blue for a moment and then ran clear, and you dried the muller and wrapped it in its soft cloth, tucking the edges of the fabric around the glass with a gentle protective care. The porphyry slab took the longest to clean because its surface was porous and held the pigment in tiny invisible pits. You poured a thin pool of water onto the slab and worked it with a scrap of clean linen, rubbing in slow circles, and the water turned a very faint, ghostly blue. The last remnant of the morning's grinding. This too went into the settling basin, and you wiped the slab dry and leaned it against the wall where it would be ready for the next day's work. The small horn spoon, the ceramic bowl, even the folded paper that had held the crushed stone, every surface that had touched the azurite was rinsed, and the rinse water saved until there was not a single grain of the precious pigment that had been lost. The settling basin now held a quantity of pale blue water that was already beginning to clarify as the heavy azurite particles sank slowly to the bottom. You could see the thin dark blue line forming at the base of the basin, a soft, velvety sediment that would thicken over the next few days until it could be collected and mixed into a fresh batch of paint. You covered the basin with a clean cloth to keep out dust, and you set it in the corner of the alcove where it would not be disturbed. The daylight had shifted again while you worked, the shadows stretching longer and deeper across the nave, and the golden quality of the light had intensified into a rich amber glow that made the old frescoes on the side walls seem to warm and deepen in color. The preacher's voice outside had become so soft and so constant that it was now indistinguishable from the sound of the wind or the distant river or the slow, steady pulse of your own blood in your ears. It had been present for so many hours that it had become a part of the chapel's own silence, a sound so familiar that it was no longer heard. The master had finished painting the border of green leaves, and the frieze stretched across the lower edge of the giornata in a neat, orderly row, each leaf a small, perfect mirror of its neighbors, each vase a quiet, rounded presence that anchored the pattern in a steady rhythm. The green was soft and muted against the pale plaster, and it made a gentle, harmonious contrast with the deep blue of the fold above and the pink glow of the small hand. The master climbed down from the scaffold and stood for a moment, looking up at the day's work, with his hands on his hips, and his head tilted slightly to one side, and then he gave a single, slow nod. The afternoon's work was done. The giornata was nearly complete now. The main elements of the Virgin's robe and the child's hand in the decorative border all laid in and beginning their slow transformation from wet paint into permanent plaster. There were still details to add, highlights and shadows, and the fine lines of the Virgin's features, but these would come in the next days, on the next giornate, as the master worked his way slowly down the wall. For now the plaster had received its colors, and it was time to begin the careful process of covering and protecting the fresh painting through the night. You gathered the mussel shells from the scaffold shelf, the blue and the green and the pink and the white, and you covered each one with a small square of damp linen to keep the paint from drying out. The shells went back into their wooden box, and the box went onto the stone ledge in the alcove, where the air was cool and still. The used brushes you collected and carried to the water barrel, rinsing each one carefully until the water ran clear, shaping the bristles with your fingers and laying them flat on a clean rag to dry. The water jar from the scaffold you emptied into the settling basin, and the empty jar you wiped clean and set back on the shelf. The chapel was growing dim now, the high windows showing a sky that had faded from blue to pale gold to a soft, dusty lavender, and the oil lamps near the altar had begun to take on a greater prominence as the natural light waned. Their flames were still the same small, steady gold petals they had been all day, but now they seemed brighter and warmer, casting soft, dancing shadows on the vaulted ceiling and the dark wooden rafters. The sacristan had not yet returned to trim the wicks and refill the oil, but he would come soon, making his slow, silent circuit of the chapel as the evening settled in. You stood in the center of the nave for a moment, your hands still and clean, your body heavy with the pleasant tiredness of a full day's work. The smell of the wet plaster and the egg tempera and the clean mineral scent of the rinsed bronze mortar all mingled in the air, and the distant, fading murmur of the preacher's voice was the only sound beyond the soft hiss of the lamps. The chapel felt peaceful and complete, its walls holding the new colors within their damp embrace, the night slow curing already beginning deep inside the plaster, where the chemical bonds were forming in the dark. You turned toward the side door, ready to begin the final task of the day, the covering and protecting of the fresh work, and then the slow, quiet walk home through the cool dusk streets. As the master climbed down from the scaffold and washed his hands in the bucket of clean water that stood near the altar, you turned your attention to the final task that would close the working day. The giornata on the wall was still damp, still curing, and the fresh colors that had been laid in with such slow and patient care needed to be protected through the night. The plaster would continue to dry and harden slowly over the next several hours. And if it dried too quickly or unevenly, the paint could crack or the surface could develop a dusty, powdery bloom that would dull the colors. The master had taught you this many years ago, and the routine of covering the work had become as automatic as the mixing of the plaster or the grinding of the stone. You walked to the water barrel and took up a large, clean linen cloth, the same kind of cloth that had been keeping the Aricio moist since the day before. You dipped the cloth into the barrel and let it soak through completely, watching the water creep upward through the fibers in a slow, dark wave. When the cloth was heavy and dripping, you lifted it out and wrung it gently with both hands, twisting it just enough so that it no longer shed water, but remained thoroughly damp and cool to the touch. The wet linen made a soft, heavy slapping sound as you carried it across the chapel toward the scaffold. The master was standing at the base of the scaffold, drying his hands on a clean rag and looking up at the giornata with a quiet, contemplative expression. The blue fold and the pink hand and the green border were all drying now, their surfaces gradually losing the wet gloss of fresh paint and taking on the soft, matte texture of cured fresco. He nodded to you as you approached with the damp cloth, and he gestured for you to climb up and begin the covering while he packed away his brushes. You climbed the scaffold slowly, holding the heavy wet cloth over one arm, and when you reached the platform you paused to look at the giornata one last time in the fading light. The Virgin's mantle swept across the upper portion of the plaster in a deep, luminous blue that seemed to hold the last glow of the afternoon within its folds, and the small hand of the Christ child reached upward with a quiet, patient tenderness. The green border ran along the lower edge in a steady, orderly row, each leaf a perfect echo of its neighbor, each small vase a calm, rounded presence. The charcoal dots of the original transfer had been absorbed into the paint and were no longer visible, and the plaster had become one with the color in a bond that would last for centuries. You turned away from the wall and set to work. The damp cloth needed to be hung in front of the giornata without touching the painted surface, because any contact would smear the fresh colors and ruin the work of the entire day. The master had devised a simple system for this, a series of small wooden pegs that had been driven into the Aricio plaster just beyond the edges of the giornata, and a thin cord that stretched between them at a distance of about 2 inches from the wall. You took the cord from its hook on the scaffold frame and strung it between the pegs, pulling it taut and tying it with a quick, familiar knot. Then you draped the damp linen over the cord, arranging it so that it hung like a curtain in front of the fresh painting, close enough to keep the air moist, but far enough away that the fabric could not brush against the colors. The damp cloth settled into place with a soft, sighing sound, and at once the air around the scaffold became cooler and more humid. You could smell the clean, wet scent of the linen mingling with the mineral smell of the plaster, and you knew that this small, simple act would keep the giornata in perfect condition through the night, allowing the chemical reaction between the lime and the pigment to proceed at its slow, natural pace. Tomorrow morning, when you arrived at the chapel, the master would remove the cloth and inspect the work, and the colors would have deepened and matured, their final beauty beginning to emerge from the pale, wet washes of the first painting. You climbed down from the scaffold and fetched a second cloth. This one a heavy leather tarp that had been treated with oil to make it waterproof. This outer covering was needed because the chapel could grow cold and damp at night, and condensation sometimes formed on the walls in the hours before dawn. You carried the leather tarp up the scaffold and hung it over the cord in front of the linen cloth, arranging it so that it formed a protective tent that would shield the fresh plaster from any dripping moisture or sudden changes in temperature. The leather creaked softly as it settled, and its familiar, earthy smell joined the other scents in the air. When the coverings were in place, you stood back and checked that everything was secure. The cord was tight, the pegs were firm, the cloths hung evenly with no sagging or gaps. The giornata was hidden now behind its night shroud, but you could still see it clearly in your mind's eye. The deep blue fold, the small pink hand, the green border, and the faint, ghostly outline of the Virgin's face that had been transferred from the cartoon and would be painted on the next giornata, in the next days, as the master worked his way slowly down the wall. You descended from the scaffold for the last time that day, and you began the final cleaning of the work area. The tools that had been used for the green earth grinding were still on the stone floor near the window, and you gathered them up and carried them to the water barrel. The bronze mortar had only a faint green residue inside it, and it rinsed clean with a single swirl of water, the pale greenish rinse going into a separate settling jar that you kept for the earth pigments. The glass muller and the porphyry slab were wiped clean with a damp rag, dried thoroughly, and returned to their places on the alcove shelf. The small horn spoon and the mixing brush were rinsed and dried and tucked into the clay pots with the other small tools. The mussel shells that still held usable paint were covered with damp linen squares and stored in the wooden box, and the box was placed in the coolest corner of the alcove where the air was still and the temperature remained steady. The few shells that had only dried smears of color left in them were set aside to be cleaned tomorrow, when you would scrape out the residue and wash the shells for reuse. Nothing was wasted, nothing was thrown away that could be saved and used again, because the master believed that good materials deserved good care, and you had absorbed this belief so deeply that it had become part of your own nature. You swept the work area with the small hand broom of twigs, gathering up the fine dust of green earth that had settled on the stone flags, and you scooped the sweepings onto the piece of old leather and carried them out to the yard. The evening air was cool and fresh, and the sky above the cloister had turned a deep, soft lavender that was already darkening to indigo in the east. A single star, very bright and steady, hung above the cypress trees, and the doves in the bell tower had fallen silent for the night. You stood for a moment in the yard, breathing the clean air and feeling the tiredness in your body settle into a warm, comfortable heaviness. And then you scattered the sweepings on the earth and went back inside. The chapel was almost dark now, the only light coming from the 3 oil lamps near the altar that the sacristan had refilled during the afternoon. Their flames were small and steady, casting a soft golden pool of light around the altar and leaving the rest of the nave in deep, velvety shadow. The master had finished packing his brushes into their wooden case, and he was standing near the side door with his cloak already on, the dark wall making him look like part of the shadows himself. He nodded to you, a slow, quiet inclination of his head that meant the day was done and the work was good, and then he lifted the iron latch and stepped out into the dusk. You lingered in the chapel for a few more minutes, moving through the small, familiar rituals of closing up. You checked the water barrel and found it still a quarter full, enough for the morning. You made sure the pigment chest was locked and the key was on its peg, and you touched the wooden lid lightly with your fingertips, knowing that inside the blue paste rested in its glass jar, waiting for the next day's painting. You checked the damp cloths on the Erixio wall and found them still moist, still doing their slow, patient work. You walked to the altar and stood for a moment looking at the small, steady flames of the oil lamps, watching the way they danced and flickered in a draught that was too faint to feel. The preacher outside had finished his sermon long ago, and the piazza was quiet now, holding only the sound of a few distant voices and the occasional slow clop of a mule's hooves on the cobblestones. The evening bells of the city began to ring, first the deep, resonant notes of the monastery tower, then the higher, thinner tones of the smaller churches, a cascade of sound that washed over the rooftops and faded slowly into the dusk. The bells were calling the faithful to vespers, but the chapel was empty now, and the sound drifted through the high windows like a blessing made of bronze and air. You walked to the side door and lifted your cloak from its peg, swinging the worn woolen fabric over your shoulders and fastening it at the throat with a simple bone clasp. You took your leather pouch of tools from the stone ledge and tied it to your belt, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of it against your hip. Then you lifted the iron latch and stepped out into the cool evening air, pulling the door closed behind you with a soft, solid thud. The narrow street was in shadow, but the sky above was still pale with the last light of the sun, a band of pale gold and soft rose that stretched along the western horizon. The air smelled of stone and evening, and the faint, distant scent of wood smoke from the chimneys of the city. You began to walk, your soft leather shoes making a quiet, steady rift, writhing fittingly as the cool bass procession, the cool damp Mauricio under your palm, the heavy white lime paste in the bucket, the sharp crack of the lapis lazuli breaking under the hammer, the slow hypnonder de quirlick the binder bind, the dined drived of the glass, the tointed prue thou the drive, that the tiny pink thing of the drive. The tiny drive that is the blood glaive, that didn't end. All these small, quiet moments had filled the day from dawn to dusk, and now they were settling in your memory like the fine blue sediment in the settling basin, layer upon layer of patient, careful work that would one day be part of a great and beautiful whole. You walked through the narrow streets of Florence as the evening deepened around you, and you did not hurry, because there was no need to hurry. The day was done, the work was good, and tomorrow you would return to the chapel and begin again, mixing plaster and grinding color and helping the master to bring the sacred scene slowly, patiently, beautifully into being on the quiet wall of San Marco.